I want to start with a moment you might recognize. You're lying awake at 2 a.m. Maybe you just lost a job you didn't realize you'd built your identity around. Maybe the relationship you thought was stable has developed a crack you can't stop staring at. Maybe it's nothing personal at all, it's just the news. The relentless sense that the systems you're trusted to hold things together are visibly straining, and the people who are supposed to fix them are fighting about whether the problem exists. You're not panicking exactly. You're doing something almost worse. You're trying to think your way through it, and your thinking keeps hitting a wall, because the usual tools don't work. You try to isolate the problem. What exactly went wrong? And it slips through your fingers. You try to figure out who to blame, and the list gets longer and less satisfying. You try to project forward what happens next, and you get either false comfort or paralysis. The problem isn't that you're thinking too little. It's that the tools you're using were built for a different kind of problem. They were built for static situations. Find the broken part, replace it, restore the previous state. But you're not dealing with a broken part. You're dealing with a system in motion. And for that, you need a different kind of thinking entirely. What follows is my attempt to hand you that tool. It's old. Genuinely old. Older than the printing press, older than democracy as we practice it. It was refined by a German philosopher who was too difficult to read, validated by a naturalist who changed how we understand life itself, and then mostly buried under the political controversies of the 20th century. But the core insight survives all of that. And I think it's exactly what 2 a.m. thinking needs. Imagine you're trying to fix a complex piece of machinery, maybe a car engine that keeps stuttering. You take it apart. You examine each piece, the spark plug, the fuel line, the battery. Each part seems fine in isolation, but when you put it all together, the problem persists. Why? Because you've been thinking in terms of isolated, static components. You haven't been thinking about the relationships between them, the flow of fuel and electricity, the timing of the cycles, the wear and tear that happens through operation. The engine isn't just a collection of parts, it's a system of processes. Now scale that up, not to an engine, but to society, to the economy, to the ecosystem, to history itself. We face problems that seem endlessly complex, political polarization that feels irreconcilable, economic crises that emerge from seemingly stable markets, environmental tipping points reached after years of gradual change. Our usual tools of analysis fail us. We try to isolate variables, to find the one broken part. But the problem is rarely one part. It's in the connections, the processes, the history of the whole system. What if there was a way of thinking, a method, specifically designed for understanding this kind of dynamic, interconnected, ever-changing reality? A method that didn't see the world as a collection of static snapshots, but as a moving pictorial process. And what if this method wasn't some new age invention, but had roots stretching back to the very dawn of philosophy? Our story begins not in a 19th century library, but by a river in ancient Greece, with a philosopher named Heraclitus. You've probably heard his most famous saying, "You cannot step into the same river twice." It's a poetic observation about constant change, right? But Heraclitus was getting at something much more radical. He wasn't just saying things change. He was proposing that change, flux, process, is the fundamental essence of reality. Stability is the illusion. He saw the world as a perpetual state of becoming, not being. And here's what's even more surprising. He observed that this process was driven by tension, by opposition. Strife is justice, he said. All things come to pass through the compulsion of strife. He saw harmony not as the absence of conflict, but as a dynamic tension of opposing forces, like the tension in a lyre that makes it functional. Think about how your immune system works. It isn't a peaceful, harmonious system. It's a war. White blood cells hunt and destroy. Pathogens evolve to evade. The body mounts fevers, inflammation, cascading chemical attacks. From the outside, it looks like catastrophic conflict. But remove the opposition entirely. Give someone an immune system that never fights, never strains, never encounters resistance, and you don't get health. You get fragility. The conflict is the function. The strife doesn't threaten the system's integrity. It is the system's integrity. Or consider a free market at its best. Competing firms don't just coexist, they pressure each other. That pressure forces innovation, drives down costs, weeds out inefficiency. The tension between competitors produces outcomes no single actor could generate alone. The moment competition collapses into monopoly, the creative friction disappears, and so does the dynamism. Even a good argument works this way. Two people genuinely pushing back against each other's ideas, not performing debate, but actually stress-testing positions, produce something neither could reach alone. The opposition isn't an obstacle to understanding. It's the mechanism of it. This is what Heraclitus meant. Not that conflict is unfortunate, but necessary. A price we pay for progress. He meant something stranger and more radical, that the tension itself is the source of order, function, and vitality. Harmony isn't what you get when opposing forces stop fighting. It's what the fighting produces, as long as the forces remain genuinely balanced. Here, in the 6th century BCE, we have the first clues. Reality is processed, driven by internal contradiction. But this view was challenging, messy, unsettling. The human mind craves stability, fixed categories, clear identities. So much of Western philosophy after Heraclitus, from Parmenides to Plato, moved in the opposite direction. They searched for permanent, unchanging truths behind the fleeting appearances. The perfect forms, the eternal essence. This is what we call static or substantialist thinking. It sees things as fixed, self-contained, and defined by their inherent essence. A table is a table because it participates in the perfect form of tableness. This way of thinking dominated for centuries. And look, it's incredibly powerful for classification, for logic, for building certain kinds of knowledge, but it struggles profoundly with change, with history, with development. And that worldview was about to crack under the weight of new evidence. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. The world is being transformed. The Industrial Revolution is turning societies upside down. Geology and paleontology are revealing an Earth that is unimaginably old, not a static creation. And then comes Darwin. Darwin shows that life itself is not a collection of fixed types, but a branching, struggling, changing historical process. The static worldview is cracking under the weight of evidence. Science is becoming the study of processes. Evolution, thermodynamics, chemical reactions, historical geology. This demanded a new way of thinking. Into this stepped a German philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel saw himself as synthesizing the entire history of human thought. He was deeply aware of the static tradition, but he was mesmerized by the new spirit of change and development. He took Heraclitus's intuition about process and contradiction and built a monumental philosophical system around it. For Hegel, everything is historical. Reality isn't a set of fixed things, it's a vast, unfolding process of development. And the engine of this development, contradiction. Hegel's great insight was that development happens through a three-step pattern, which he called the dialectic. It starts with a thesis, an idea of a form of life, a historical state. This thesis contains within itself its own opposite, its own negation, its internal flaw or limitation, the antithesis. The tension between thesis and antithesis isn't a problem to be eliminated. It's the fuel for growth. This tension builds until it resolves into a new stage, the synthesis. But the synthesis doesn't just cancel the previous stages. It sublights them, it cancels them, preserves them, and lifts them up to a higher level. Let me make this concrete with an example Hegel loved: freedom. Imagine a primitive state of nature, the thesis. In this state, you have absolute freedom to do anything, but so does everyone else. This leads to a war of all against all, where your freedom is constantly negated by the freedom of others. Consider the precise logical mechanism at work here, for it reveals the engine of Hegel's entire system. In this primitive thesis, freedom is defined exclusively as pure potential, the total absence of external constraint. It is the condition of being able to say, I can do whatever I will, subject to no law but my own whim. In this state, the individual self stands as a sovereign absolute, a universe of one. The dynamic of negation begins the moment a second person enters that universe, with the exact same definition of freedom. What follows is not merely a disagreement or a fight. It is a structural, inescapable collision of wills that dissolves the very concept of liberty. First, there is the physical negation. If I am absolutely free to walk anywhere, I might choose to walk through the exact space where the other is standing. But the other is absolutely free to stand wherever they please. Two bodies cannot occupy the same coordinates. My freedom of movement is negated by the other's freedom of stillness. This is not a choice. It is a geometric necessity imposed by the mere existence of another being in a shared world. The space of freedom shrinks the moment it must be shared. Second, and more profoundly, there is the volitional negation. Absolute freedom means I can impose my will upon reality. But the other is also a center of will, and their desires are almost certain to conflict with mine. I wish to sleep in peace and security. The other wishes to make noise, or to test their strength against my shelter. I wish to take an apple from a tree. The other wishes to take the very same apple. In each instance, the exercise of their freedom directly extinguishes the exercise of mine. If I am forced to defend my food or my rest, I am no longer free to simply be. I am a prisoner of the other's whims. And if I silence the other by force to reclaim my own peace, I have negated their freedom, proving that absolute liberty cannot coexist with itself. Third, there is the most subtle and devastating layer, the psychological negation. Hegel's insight, later made famous in his master, Slave Dialectics, that a free consciousness craves recognition. I need the other to see me as a free being. But an individual who defines freedom as absolute self-interest has no logical reason to grant that recognition. To the other, I am not a fellow sovereign. I am merely an obstacle in the landscape, a tool to be used, or a threat to be neutralized. When I look into the eyes of the other and see only the reflection of my own objectification, my sense of self as a free, dignified person is annihilated. I am reduced to a thing in their world, just as they are reduced to a thing in mine. This is not a static, one-time confrontation. It creates a dynamic feedback loop of systemic collapse. I build a fence for safety. They tear it down because their absolute freedom includes the right to walk that path. I speak my truth. They shout me down because their freedom of expression supersedes my own. Each individual act of freedom generates a reciprocal act of negation, plunging both parties into a perpetual state of defense, toil, and fear. In this raw state, the concept of freedom becomes a universal acid. It dissolves the very conditions of peace and predictability required for anyone to enjoy a single moment of genuine liberty. Absolute freedom, when multiplied by 2 or more, proves to be self-canceling. The promise of the thesis that I am everything collapses under the weight of the other into a state where I am effectively nothing. I am either dead, enslaved, or cowering in the shadows. That is why Hegel identifies this moment as the unbearable contradiction. You cannot solve it by killing the other, for you would simply be alone again, with a meaningless freedom that has no world in which to express itself. The contradiction does not permit a retreat. It demands a resolution. It forces thought to move to a higher plane. That's the antithesis. The contradiction is unbearable. The synthesis, the social contract, the state with laws. This seems to limit individual freedom, but in reality, it creates a higher, more secure form of freedom. Civil liberty under the rule of law. The raw, self-destructive freedom is cancelled, but the core idea of freedom is preserved and elevated within a new framework. This is the dialectic in action. But here's the crucial thing. Hegel's system was idealist. For him, the ultimate reality was the idea, spirit, thought. Nature and history were just the external unfolding of this logical idea. Many of his contemporaries, especially scientists and empirically minded philosophers, rejected this as mystical speculation. They wanted to explain the world through material causes, not abstract ideas. This is where 19th century process philosophers entered the scene. They were steeped in the scientific advances of their day. They saw the revolutionary power of Darwin's materialist explanation for life's history. And they were stuck with a puzzle. Hegel seemed right about the pattern of change, but wrong about its foundation. So they asked a bold question. What if the dialectic wasn't a law of an abstract spirit imposing itself on the world, but was actually a pattern discovered in the material world itself? What of the logic of change that Hegel saw in history and thought was simply a reflection of how matter, nature, and society actually develop? This was a philosophical revolution. They took Hegel's dialectic and stood it on its feet, as they later said. They argued that the mind's dialectical logic works because reality is dialectical. Our thinking, when it's correct, mirrors the actual processes of the world. This flipped everything. Instead of starting with grand ideas, you start with concrete, material reality, and study its history and interconnections. The dialectic becomes a method of investigation, not a speculative system. This is the forgotten tool. So what does this materialist, process-oriented dialectic look like as a thinking tool? It's built on a few core principles, all observable in the world. First, the transformation of quantity into quality. This is the idea that change isn't always smooth and linear. Take heating water. You add heat degree by degree, that's quantitative change. For a long time it's just hotter water. 90 degrees, 95 degrees, 99 degrees. But at 100 degrees Celsius, at a specific pressure, something revolutionary happens. It boils, it becomes steamer, qualitatively different state with new properties. It expands, it can drive turbines. The change is a leap. This is everywhere. In social life, gradual increases in economic inequality, quantitative, can reach a point that triggers social unrest or revolution, a qualitative change in the social order. In ecology, the gradual accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere leads to qualitative climate shifts. The processed philosophers argued that to understand revolutions in politics, in science, in nature, you must understand the long, slow, quantitative build-ups that make them inevitable. Second principle, the interpenetration and unity of opposites. This is the Heraclitean idea, supercharged. It says that seemingly opposite forces are not just external enemies. They are internally connected and necessary to each other. They define each other. Take a star, a massive ball of gas that should either collapse under its own weight or explode outward. So why doesn't it? A star exists because of the titanic struggle between opposing forces. The inward force of gravity versus the outward force of nuclear fusion. The principle, opposites are internally connected and necessary to each other. There is no north without south, no positive charge without negative, no life without death. More than that, the interaction, the struggle, the tension between these opposites is the internal source of motion and development. An ecosystem is defined by the interplay of competition and cooperation, growth and decay. In society, technological innovation creates both new opportunities and new forms of obsolescence and disruption. The process method tells us not to wish away contradiction, but to analyze it as the engine of the system. The goal isn't to find a bland, conflict-free middle, but to understand how the conflict drives the process forward and what new syntheses it might produce. Third principle, the negation of the negation, or the spiral of development. This describes the pattern of historical progress. An initial state is negated by its opposite, but the story doesn't end with simple destruction. That negation is itself negated, resulting in a new synthesis that seems to return to aspects of the original, but at a higher, richer, more developed level. It's a spiral, not a circle. Classic biological example, a seed. The seed, thesis, is negated when it germinates and grows into a plant. The antithesis, the seed is destroyed. The plant then grows, flowers, and produces new seeds. Negation of the negation. You have seeds again, but not the same seed. More seeds at the end of a cycle of growth and development. In technology, we see this all the time. Early personal computers or standalone machines, the thesis. The internet seemed to negate that, pushing us toward networked terminals and thin clients. the antithesis, but the synthesis, the powerful, networked personal computer, the laptop, the smartphone. It combines the local processing power of the original thesis with the connectivity of the antithesis. It's a return to a form of local computing, but on a vastly higher level. Development doesn't just destroy and replace, it preserves, elevates, and transforms. Now, you might be thinking, this is interesting as historical philosophy, but is it science? Or is it just imposing a fancy pattern on things? This was the central challenge our process philosophers took up. They argued vigorously that this wasn't a pattern imposed on nature from philosophy, but a pattern discovered in nature by science. They pointed to three great scientific discoveries of their century as proof. First, the discovery of the cell, which showed the common, process-driven unit of all organic life. Second, the law of conservation and transformation of energy, which showed that all natural forces are interconnected and convertible parts of one dynamic process. And third, Darwin's theory of evolution, which provided the grand narrative of qualitative transformation through quantitative variation and the struggle of opposites. But let's examine these three scientific discoveries that support process philosophy. Before the 19th century, the living world was seen as a static hierarchy of fixed species, a great chain of being where each link was eternal and separate. The discovery of the cell shattered that picture. Scientists like Schleiden and Schwann demonstrated that despite the dizzying variety of life, from a blade of grass to a human brain, everything is composed of the same fundamental, living unit. But more importantly, they revealed that the cell is not a static building block, like a brick in a wall. It is a nexus of processes. It breathes, metabolizes, divides, and dies. Within its membrane, opposing chemical forces, building up anabolism and breaking down capitalism, are in constant tension, and it is precisely this internal contradiction that keeps the cell alive. Here was empirical proof of the dialectical principle of the unity of opposites in nature. The cell is a thing only insofar as it is a continuous activity. The old category of life as a fixed, mysterious essence gave way to the new understanding of life as a specific, material, and dialectical organization of matter. The hierarchy of being was replaced by a common, unfolding process. The second pillar was the discovery of the law of conservation and transformation of energy. For centuries, physicists had treated heat, light, electricity, and mechanical motion as separate, siloed phenomena. They were distinct, imponderable fluids with their own rules. But the work of Joule Meyer and Helmholtz proved otherwise. They showed that when motion stops, heat appears not by magic, but by a precise, measurable transformation. Friction turns mechanical work into heat. A steam engine turns heat back into work. A battery turns chemical energy into electricity. The crucial dialectical insight here is the negation of the negation. Motion seems to disappear. It is negated, but it does not vanish into nothingness. It is sublated, cancelled as motion, preserved as heat, and elevated to a potential for new work. This discovery proved that the universe is not a collection of static forces, but a single, dynamic, interconnected system of conversions. It demonstrated the transformation of quantity into quality as well. A quantitative increase in heat does not just make a hotter object. At a specific threshold, it qualitatively changes the state of matter, ice to water to steam, or ignites a chemical reaction. The static, compartmentalized view of physics was untenable. Reality was a vast web of energetic process. Finally, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection provided the grand narrative for the living world. Prior to Darwin, the staggering adaptation of organisms, the eye, the wing, the camouflage of an insect, was explained by reference to a divine static plan. Darwin replaced that plan with a material history. He showed that new species emerged not through sudden, miraculous leaps, but through the slow, quantitative accumulation of tiny, random variations over immense stretches of time. Here was the dialectical law of quantity into quality, made manifest in the fossil record and the breeding pen. A slight variation in beak size offers no great advantage today, but over generations, that quantitative shift reaches a tipping point where a population becomes reproductively isolated. A new species is born. Furthermore, the engine of this change is the struggle of opposites, the contradiction between the tendency of organisms to overpopulate and the finite resources of the environment. This war of all against all in nature is not a flaw. It is the creative force that drives adaptation, complexity, and diversity. Darwin showed that the order we see in nature is not the result of a static blueprint, but the temporary resolution of a continuous historical process of conflict and adaptation. So what did process philosophers make of these scientific discoveries? Their argument: science, by piling up empirical facts about processes, chemical reactions, biological evolution, geological change, was forcing a new dialectical way of thinking upon us. The old, static, compartmentalized categories were breaking down. They warned that scientists who swore off all philosophy were often the most enslaved by outdated, unconscious philosophical ideas. Do you remember the saying, the brain secretes thought like the liver secretes bile? That's itself a simplistic, non-dialectical metaphysical claim. So what is this method for? It's a tool for critical thinking in a complex world. When you're faced with a seemingly intractable problem like political polarization, the dialectical method doesn't tell you to pick a side. It tells you to analyze the historical development that led to these opposing positions. It asks, what are the underlying social and economic quantities that have built up to this qualitative divide? How do these opposing viewpoints interpenetrate and depend on each other? Each defines itself against the other. What possible synthesis could negate the current deadlock and create a new, higher political configuration? Perhaps one that preserves certain valid concerns from both sides while moving beyond the current framework. It's a tool for seeing crises as moments of potential transformation, not just breakdown. From who's right to what's the process and where can it go. It's a tool for understanding your own field. Whether you're in tech, art, business, or education, you can ask, what are the internal contradictions driving change in my field? Where is the quantitative build-up heading towards a qualitative leap? What old forms are being negated, and what new synthesis is struggling to be born? Not a crystal ball, but a framework for seeing the forces at work. It helps you anticipate transformation instead of being blindsided by them. This way of thinking was a product of its time, a time of unprecedented upheaval and discovery. It was an attempt to build a coherent worldview that could do justice to a universe in flux. A worldview that was rigorously materialist, grounded in evidence, yet capable of understanding complexity, emergence, and history. It bridged the gap between the rich but often speculative philosophical tradition and the powerful but sometimes narrow empirical sciences. The story from Heraclitus's river to Hegel's system to the process philosophers of the 19th century is the story of humanity refining a tool for understanding change. It's a tool that warns against rigid either-or thinking. It urges us to look for the connections, the history, the process. It tells us that contradiction isn't a sign of error, but a sign of a living, developing system. In an age of seemingly fragmented knowledge and polarized debates, we have the engine problem at global scale. Old ways of thinking are failing us. Perhaps this ancient and modern method of thought is the forgotten tool we need to put back in our intellectual toolkit, not as a dogma, but as a guide to asking better questions. Look for the patterns, quantitative leaps becoming qualitative, interpenetrating opposites, spiraling development. What do you think? Can you see examples of these patterns in the world around you? Have you ever used a similar kind of systems thinking to solve a problem without knowing the philosophical history behind it? Where do you see the most glaring need for this kind of dynamic, process-oriented thinking today? Let's talk about the patterns of change in the comments. But wait, so now that we've laid all of this out, Heraclitus, Hegel, the whole arc, I want to do something a little unusual. I want to try to break it. Because any method that claims to be a universal tool for understanding change deserves to be stress-tested by the very kind of rigorous, contradiction-seeking analysis it recommends. So here are 8 serious objections to everything we just covered, and the best defenses I can muster against each one. The sharpest immediate objection is this: the dialectical framework isn't a predictive tool, it's a retrospective one. You can look at almost any historical event and, working backwards, assign the labels of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis with confident authority. The French monarchy was the thesis, the revolution was the antithesis, the Napoleonic state was the synthesis. Neat. But this kind of storytelling explains everything and therefore predicts nothing. If the method cannot tell us what will happen next, only why what already happened was inevitable, it isn't a thinking tool. It's astrology for historians. This objection has real teeth, but it misreads what the method actually claims. The dialectic is not a crystal ball. It's a framework for seeing where the forces are at work. And this points to a crucial distinction between prediction in simple systems and prediction in complex ones. You cannot tell someone the exact second their part of water will boil, but you can tell them with absolute certainty that if they keep applying heat, a qualitative change is coming. The framework tells you where the pressure is building, not when the pipe will burst. Someone fluent in this kind of thinking, looking at the quantitative accumulation of economic precarity in the early 2000s, would have known a political boiling point was coming, even without being able to name the year or the candidate. The tool shifts the question from what is the final fixed state to where is the tension accumulating. That is a genuine and consequential shift in how you look at the world, even without precise prediction. Hegel is, to put it generously, notoriously difficult. His prose is dense, circular, and frequently opaque. Critics from Karl Popper onward have argued that his vague invocations of spirit and negation aren't profound philosophy. They're sophisticated word games, impressive-sounding constructions that collapse under scrutiny into nothing testable. Why should we trust a method derived from a philosopher who claimed, in essence, to know the mind of God? Here's the thing though, we're not being asked to trust Hegel's conclusions. The whole pivot in the story we told was the moment the 19th century process philosophers took his structural insight and grounded it not in mystical spirit, but in Darwin, in thermodynamics, in the cell. We're not adopting the idealism, we're borrowing the pattern. The observation that systems contain internal contradictions that drive them toward qualitative transformation, a pattern that maps with remarkable precision onto how stars burn, how species evolve, and how markets behave. Newton had mystical beliefs that would make most modern physicists uncomfortable. The calculus still works. The map is not invalidated by the cartographer's eccentricities. Here's a more ethically serious pushback. If tension and contradiction are the engines of all development, if strife is justice, as Heraclitus said, does this framework provide cover for leaving harmful power imbalances in place? Could someone use this thinking to argue that oppression is just a productive contradiction generating a future synthesis, and therefore shouldn't be directly confronted? This deserves a genuine partial concession because taking it seriously actually strengthens the method. The dialectic does not sanctify all conflict as generative. What it provides is a tool for distinguishing between two very different kinds of tension. Functional contradictions, which are structurally necessary to a system and drive its development, and contingent contradictions, which reflect mere power imbalances or historical accidents and generate no creative synthesis. Heraclitus was precise about this. Harmony requires balanced opposing forces. When one force radically overwhelms the other, the result isn't creative tension, it's collapse. A star where gravity overwhelms fusion doesn't produce a new stage of development. It produces a black hole. An immune system where the attacking function overwhelms its regulatory function doesn't produce health. It produces autoimmune disease. Abuse and injustice are not generative, dialectical tensions. They are cases where the balance has already broken down. Identifying them as such is precisely what the method is designed to do. Setting aside the philosophy, a pragmatic person might push back here. What does this actually change about how you make decisions? It produces beautiful questions, sure. Where is the quantitative build-up heading? What contradiction is driving the system? But it doesn't give you a step-by-step algorithm. Is this just a sophisticated repackaging of intuitions people already apply naturally? The answer is concrete. The method changes the questions you ask before you act, and different questions produce genuinely different interventions. Think about a manager dealing with a team in chronic conflict. If the question is, who is wrong, the intervention is discipline or termination. If the question is, what structural contradiction is this conflict expressing, and what has been building to produce it, the intervention looks completely different. It might address resource allocation, role clarity, or an impossible performance mandate. Or consider a company where every leader in a particular division burns out within 18 months. The surface diagnosis: bad luck in hiring or poor self-care culture. The dialectical diagnosis: an internal structural contradiction, say between pressure to perform and resources provided to perform, that will reproduce the same result in every person placed in that role until the structural tension is resolved. One diagnosis leads to replacing people. The other leads to redesigning the system. The method doesn't hand you the answer. It tells you which question to ask first, and that's where most failures actually originate. This is probably the strongest objection. Chaos theory, systems dynamics, cybernetics, network science, these fields model feedback loops, phase transitions, and non-linear change with mathematical precision that Hegel and his contemporaries could never have imagined. They provide rigorous, empirically testable frameworks for the exact phenomena we've been describing. So why reach for 19th century philosophy? Why use a rusty hammer when lasers exist? The relationship between the dialectical method and modern complexity, science runs in the opposite direction from what this objection assumes. The method is not an inferior substitute for those mathematical tools. It's their conceptual complement. Network science can show you that a particular node is becoming a hub. The dialectical framework asks why the system is under stress that demands a new hub in the first place. Chaos theory tells you that small changes can produce large effects. The dialectical method reminds you that those effects aren't random. They're internally mediated by the system's own structural contradictions. Data scientists frequently have rich mathematical models and impoverished historical and qualitative context. They see a spike in the data and miss the accumulating social tension that the spike is expressing. The two approaches are tools for different levels of analysis. A thinker fluent in both is more capable than one fluent in only one. A scientifically minded viewer might object specifically to the unity of opposites principle. A star isn't a unity of gravity and fusion, it's just a star. Those are two separate physical forces interacting. Calling them opposites in unity is poetic language, not analytical insight. If we label any two interacting things as opposites in unity, we've added a philosophical caption to a physics textbook without increasing anyone's understanding of the physics. The response comes down to one distinction: the difference between external and internal relations. When you drop a ball, your hand and the floor are externally related. The floor exists perfectly well without the ball. The interaction is incidental, and both entities maintain their identities independently of each other. But gravity and nuclear fusion in a star are internally related. You cannot have the star, the entity, without both forces in active contradiction. Remove gravity, and you have a diffuse cloud of gas. Remove fusion, and you have a collapsing object heading toward a singularity. The star is not a thing that happens to have two forces acting on it. The star is the process of that specific tension, and this distinction matters practically. If you believe your organization's problem is an external one, a bad actor who entered the system, you remove the actor. If you recognize it as an internal structural tension, you understand that removing one person without changing the structural conditions will simply regenerate the same problem in whoever comes next. Identifying whether a contradiction is internal or external is one of the most consequential analytical moves you can make. That principle is the tool that makes that distinction visible. So here's what I actually want you to walk away with. Not the names, not the system, not even the three principles as abstract concepts. I want you to walk away with three questions, ones you can ask the next time you're in the middle of something that feels like it's falling apart. Question 1. What has been building? Whatever crisis you're facing, personal, professional, political, almost certainly didn't arrive from nowhere. There was a slow accumulation you may have been trained to ignore because nothing dramatic was happening yet. The quantitative build-up before the qualitative leap. So ask, what had been slowly, quietly changing before this broke open? Not to assign blame retroactively, but because understanding the build-up tells you something crucial. This isn't random. It's the result of a process. And processes can be understood even when their eruptions feel like chaos. Question 2. What opposing forces are actually holding this together? When something breaks, our instinct is to find the thing that's wrong and remove it. But most systems, including relationships, careers, communities, and bodies, are held in place by tension, not harmony. The breakdown often isn't caused by the presence of conflict. It's caused by the collapse of a balance that conflict was maintaining. So ask, what two forces have been in tension here? And what happens if one of them disappears entirely? Sometimes this reveals that what looked like the problem is actually the thing that was keeping a worse outcome at bay. Sometimes it reveals that the real intervention isn't elimination, it's rebalancing. Question 3. What is this negating, and what might it be making room for? This is the hardest question, and I don't offer it as comfort exactly, more as a different frame. When something ends, something's negated. The old form is destroyed. But destruction in a living system isn't usually just loss, it's also clearance. So ask, not immediately, not while you're still in shock, but eventually. What was the thing that just ended actually preventing? What couldn't exist while that structure was in place? This question won't make the loss smaller, but it can shift you from the experience of pure subtraction to the experience of standing at a threshold. And that shift from everything is being taken away to something is ending so something else can begin is not denial. It's the oldest and most empirically grounded story we have about how change actually works. You clicked on this because the world, or your world, feels like it's falling apart. I can't tell you it isn't. I can't promise the synthesis that emerges from your current contradiction will arrive on schedule or look the way you hope. But I can't tell you that the falling apart is not the end of the story. It is, if the pattern holds, and it has held. From Heraclitus's river to the stars burning overhead, the part of the story just before something genuinely new becomes possible. That's not nothing, especially at 2 a.m. Now, as you can see, the video is not over, and that is because there is much more to discuss. You have finished part 1 of this essay, so let's move on to part 2. Let's start with a scene that might feel familiar. You're sitting with a real problem, a medical diagnosis that 2 doctors have interpreted differently, a financial decision where every expert seems to be contradicting the last one, a political crisis where the people who are supposed to understand it can't agree on the most basic facts. You're not a passive observer of this disagreement. The outcome matters to you personally, concretely, in ways that will shape the next year or decade of your life. And you're trying to figure out who to listen to. Not in the abstract. Right now. With limited time and a decision that cannot wait. The temptation runs in two directions, and both of them will fail you. The first is naive deference, finding the person with the most impressive credentials and outsourcing your judgment entirely. The second is reflexive cynicism, deciding that since experts disagree, they're all compromised, or captured, or performing expertise rather than possessing it, and you might as well trust your instincts. Both of these are understandable. Neither of them is thinking. They're escapes from thinking, ways of resolving the unbearable tension of uncertainty without actually doing the work of navigating it. There's a harder path. It runs through a question that a Viennese philosopher named Karl Popper spent his life trying to answer. A question that sounds academic until you realize it's the most practical question you can ask in a world drowning in sophisticated sounding noise. What would have to be true for this to be wrong? Popper's problem, which he called the demarcation problem, was deceptively simple. What separates genuine scientific knowledge from claims that merely dress themselves in the language of science? He arrived at it in early 20th century Vienna, watching psychoanalysis and astrology both claim the mantle of science while behaving, he noticed, in a peculiar way. They were unfalsifiable. Every piece of evidence could be absorbed into the theory. A patient who got better after psychoanalysis confirmed the theory. A patient who got worse also confirmed it. The resistance itself was evidence of the repressed material that theory predicted. The theory couldn't lose. And for Popper, that was exactly the problem. A theory that can't lose isn't explaining the world, it's describing itself. His answer was falsifiability. A genuine scientific claim is one that makes specific predictions about what we should not see if it's true. Predictions that could, in principle, be checked and found wrong. Einstein's theory of relativity didn't just accommodate existing data. It made precise, risky predictions about the bending of light around massive objects. When Eddington's 1919 expedition confirmed those predictions, it was meaningful precisely because a different result would have genuinely threatened the theory. The theory was sticking its neck out. That's what gives it credibility when it survives. A claim that sticks its neck out for nothing, risks nothing, and tells you nothing. Now here's where Popper's insight collides with Hegel's, and something genuinely useful emerges from the collision. Remember the dialectic from part 1. A thesis contains within itself the seed of its own negation. The tension between thesis and antithesis drives the system towards something new. Part 1 used this to explain how historical change works, how the slow quantitative build-up of contradictions eventually produces qualitative leaps. But there's a version of this that operates inside the history of knowledge itself, and Popper, though he was famously hostile to Hegel, was describing something structurally Hegelian without realizing it. Every dominant paradigm in science is a kind of thesis. It explains a wide range of phenomena, generates productive research, and becomes institutionally entrenched. But it also carries within itself the seeds of its negation, the anomalies it can't explain, the edge cases that don't fit, the experiments that produce results the theory can't absorb. These anomalies are the antithesis building slowly inside the thesis. What Popper added was the criterion for distinguishing a living thesis from a dead one. A living thesis, a genuine scientific framework, acknowledges its anomalies. It treats them as problems to be solved, not embarrassments to be explained away. It actively invites attempts at falsification, because surviving serious attempts to break it is what makes it trustworthy. A dead thesis does the opposite. It becomes baroque. Every anomaly gets a new epicycle bolted on. The theory grows more elaborate, precisely to protect its core from contact with disconfirming evidence. It produces what philosophers call ad hoc modifications, patches whose only purpose is to prevent the theory from being tested, not to explain anything new. When you're watching two experts argue on television, this distinction is the most useful thing you can bring to the screen. Is either of them saying what would change their mind? Is either of them pointing to evidence that would, if it came back differently, force them to revise their position? Or are they both in the mode of absorbing every possible outcome into their existing view? The one who can answer here is what would prove me wrong is operating in the space of genuine knowledge, even if they turn out to be mistaken. The one who has an explanation for every possible outcome, who cannot be surprised by any evidence, is not giving you knowledge. They're giving you ideology dressed as expertise. This matters at the personal scale more than it might seem. Take the experience of losing a job you'd built your identity around. The opening scenario from part 1. In the immediate aftermath, you will encounter a remarkable number of people offering frameworks for what happened and what you should do next. Some of them will be experts of a kind, career coaches, economists talking about labor markets, people in your industry with confident opinions about where things are heading. Apply the falsifiability question. When the career coach tells you that personal branding is the key to your next opportunity, ask internally, what would have to happen for that to be wrong? If they can't answer, if every possible outcome would somehow confirm the importance of personal branding, you're not receiving advice. You're receiving a sales pitch with the structure of advice. When the economist tells you the labor market in your sector is tightening or expanding, ask, what data are they looking at, and what data would change their assessments? If they can name it, they're operating with intellectual honesty. If the answer is always well, but you also have to consider, followed by an indefinitely expanding set of qualifications, something else is happening. This is not cynicism. It's the opposite of cynicism. Cynicism says all claims are equally worthless. Falsifiability says claims can be ranked by how seriously they take the possibility of being wrong. And that ranking actually tells you something real about who to listen to. But Popper alone is insufficient, and this is where the dialectical frame becomes essential rather than decorative. Popper's original formulation had a clean, almost algorithmic quality. Science advances by bold conjecture and attempted refutation. Propose something specific. Try to break it. If it survives, tentatively accept it. This is enormously useful, but it runs into a problem that later philosophers of science, particularly Imre Lakatos and Paul Feyerabend, identified with precision. Real science doesn't actually work this way, and neither does real life. The problem is that no theory faces evidence in isolation. Every claim comes embedded in a web of auxiliary assumptions, background beliefs about how instruments work. What other variables are constant? What the relevant comparison cases are? When an experiment seems to disconfirm a theory, It's never entirely clear whether the theory itself is wrong, or whether one of the dozens of supporting assumptions is what failed. This is not a theoretical objection. It is the lived experience of trying to navigate contradictory expert opinion on anything genuinely complex. The efficacy of a medical treatment, the cause of an economic downturn, the likely trajectory of a geopolitical crisis. The same data set, the same body of evidence, genuinely supports different conclusions depending on which auxiliary assumptions you bring to it. This isn't because the experts are lying. It's because the relationship between evidence and theory is always mediated by a background structure that is itself invisible and contestable. What this means practically is that the demarcation problem can't be solved once and finally. It has to be applied as a continuous practice, not a single test. And here the dialectic reasserts itself, because the history of science, looked at honestly, is not a story of theories being cleanly falsified and replaced. It's a story of competing research programs, each with its own core commitments, each generating its own anomalies, each defending its core against falsification through legitimate and sometimes illegitimate means, locked in ongoing tension. The synthesis emerges not when one program falsifies the other in a single decisive experiment, but when the accumulated weight of anomalies in one framework becomes impossible to manage, and a new framework offers to explain both the old successes and the old anomalies more cleanly. This is Kuhn's paradigm shift, which we'll explore more fully in Part 3. But even without the full apparatus, the insight is immediately applicable. The political dimension of this deserves direct attention, because it's where the problem is most acute and most personal. When you're watching people fight about whether a problem even exists, whether the economic forces gutting your industry are real, whether the institutional failures you're experiencing are structural or just bad luck, you're inside a paradigm dispute, not a factual one. And the frustrating truth is that both sides of that dispute have genuine evidence. They're not simply lying. They're operating with different auxiliary assumptions that make the same data look different. The falsifiability question doesn't resolve this instantly, but it does something more useful. It gives you a way to evaluate the intellectual honesty of the people making the case, independent of the content of the case itself. A politician or commentator who says, "Here is what I predicted, here is whether it came true, and here is how I've updated my position," is operating in the space of falsifiable claims. A politician or commentator who has a story for every possible outcome, for whom no result is ever surprising, for whom every piece of evidence confirms what they already believed, is operating in the space of unfalsifiable ideology. The content of their position matters too, obviously, but the epistemic structure of how they hold that position tells you something prior, whether they're capable of being wrong, and someone who is not capable of being wrong is not capable of being right in any meaningful sense. They're just generating noise in the register of knowledge. Now let's pull the thread back to the personal, because this is where the demarcation problem gets emotionally complicated in a way the philosophy textbooks tend to underplay. When the systems you trusted to adjudicate truth, institutions, experts, media, science itself in its public presentation, have been damaged in your experience, you're not just facing an intellectual problem, you're facing something closer to grief. The naive deference was load-bearing. It was doing work you didn't notice it was doing, freeing you to focus on your life without having to personally adjudicate every contested claim about how the world works. Losing that is a real loss. Rebuilding a functional relationship with expertise after it's been damaged is not simply a matter of learning better epistemology. It requires something more like what Hegel would call a higher synthesis, one that cancels the naive deference, preserves what was actually valuable in it. Recognizing that some people genuinely know more than you about specific things and elevates it into something more robust. That higher synthesis looks like this: calibrated trust, extended and withdrawn, based on observable behavior rather than credentials or tribal affiliation. You extend trust to the expert who names what would change their mind. You extend it to the institution that corrects its errors publicly and explains what went wrong. You extend it to the commentator who has a track record, not of always being right, but of updating when the evidence changes. You withdraw it regardless of credentials from anyone whose framework cannot be surprised. This is harder than naive deference. It requires you to hold the question open, to track claims over time, to notice when predictions fail and how the person making them responds. It demands what you might call active epistemic citizenship, not the passive consumption of authoritative pronouncements, but the ongoing practice of asking whether the people speaking are operating in the space where being wrong is possible. The reward for doing this work is not certainty. I want to be honest about that. You will not arrive at a position from which you can be confident in every claim that matters to your life. The world is genuinely complex, the evidence is genuinely underdetermined, and the experts are genuinely in dispute on questions that have real stakes. But you will gain something more durable than certainty. You'll gain a functional way of distributing your epistemic trust, of knowing which voices to weight heavily, which to treat as starting points for your own investigation, and which to discount regardless of their apparent authority. That's not nothing. In a world where the sheer volume of sophisticated-sounding noise is itself a form of disorientation, knowing how to tune it is a survival skill. And here is the dialectical point that ties this to part 1. The crisis of trust you're navigating is not simply a breakdown. It is, if the pattern holds, a thesis exhausting itself. The naive deference to institutional authority was always going to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Institutions that couldn't be questioned became institutions that couldn't self-correct. Expertise that demanded deference rather than earning it became expertise that served its own reproduction, more than it served the people it claimed to inform. The antithesis, the reflexive cynicism, the do-your-own-research, the rejection of expertise as such, is the inevitable response. It overcorrects, catastrophically in many cases. But it is the negation that the original thesis made inevitable. The synthesis, which is what you're trying to build. Whether you know it or not, when you're lying awake trying to figure out who to listen to, is something genuinely new. It's a relationship with knowledge that is neither credulous nor cynical. It's demanding, curious, and provisional. It extends trust where trust is earned by intellectual behavior, not by credential or charisma. It holds its own conclusions loosely enough to update when the evidence demands it. That synthesis doesn't arrive on a schedule. Building it is slow, uncomfortable, and ongoing. But it is the thing worth building. And Popper's question, what would have to be true for this to be wrong, is the tool you use to build it. Ask it early. Ask it often. Ask it especially of the claims you most want to be true. That last instruction is the hardest one, and it's the most important. There's a particular kind of stuck that's different from ordinary confusion. Ordinary confusion feels like fog. You can't see clearly, but you know the landscape is there, and you trust that if you move carefully, you'll find your footing. This other kind of stuck feels more like standing in a room where every wall is a mirror. You look for the exit and see only reflections of yourself looking. You think harder, and your thinking confirms what you already believed. You seek out new information, and somehow it keeps arriving pre-sorted into categories that already existed in your head. The situation is one of certainty rather than confusion, and that certainty is the problem. This is what Thomas Kuhn was describing when he wrote about scientific paradigms in 1962, in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that was supposed to be a Miesicht to the philosophy of science, and accidentally became one of the most widely cited academic works of the 20th century. Kuhn was trying to understand something that bothered him about the official story of how science progresses, the clean, cumulative narrative of facts building on facts. Knowledge expanding smoothly outward in all directions like a ripple in still water. That story, he argued, was at odds with what the history of science actually showed. What the history showed was something stranger, more turbulent, and in the end far more illuminating. Not just about science, but about the specific kind of stuck that is the subject of this video. Kuhn's central observation was that scientists don't work in a vacuum of pure inquiry. They work inside what he called a paradigm, a framework of assumptions, methods, exemplary problems, and accepted solutions that defines what counts as a legitimate question, what counts as a valid method, and what counts as a satisfying answer. The paradigm encompasses far more than a single theory. It comprises the entire cognitive infrastructure within which theories get built and tested. And here's what makes this more than an academic point. The paradigm is mostly invisible to the people inside it. It functions as the structure through which you see, rather than a conscious set of beliefs you could write down and examine. It determines which anomalies look significant and which look like noise. It shapes what feels like progress and what feels like a dead end. It is, in the most literal sense, the framework that makes your experience of your field legible. Normal science, the everyday work of researchers, the accumulation of papers and experiments and refinements, happens inside the paradigm. It's puzzle solving. The paradigm defines what a puzzle looks like, and normal science solves puzzles within those definitions. This is enormously productive. You can accomplish extraordinary things when everyone agrees on the rules. But the paradigm also generates what Kuhn called anomalies, results that don't fit, observations the framework can't absorb, problems that resist solution no matter how much normal science is applied to them. For a long time, anomalies get explained away, set aside, attributed to experimental error, or quietly ignored. The paradigm is load-bearing. Too much depends on it, and individual anomalies aren't enough to threaten it. Scientists are, in this respect, rationally conservative. You don't abandon a functional infrastructure because of a few unexplained results. But anomalies accumulate. And at some point, not a predetermined point, not a logical threshold, but a felt one, a moment when the patches and workarounds and auxiliary explanations have become more elaborate than the core theory they're protecting. The field enters what Kuhn called a state of crisis. The paradigm begins to visibly strain. Multiple competing frameworks emerge, none of them fully satisfying. Foundational questions that had been settled get reopened. The consensus that made normal science possible dissolves. And then, not always, not automatically, but sometimes, a new paradigm emerges. It arrives as a replacement rather than a refinement of the old one. The world, seen through the new framework, looks genuinely different. Problems that were insoluble under the old paradigm dissolve entirely, because the new framework reveals that they were artifacts of the old framework's assumptions, not features of reality itself. Kuhn called this a paradigm shift. And the crucial, uncomfortable thing he said about it was this: the process, in the narrow sense, cannot be considered strictly rational. You cannot argue someone into a paradigm shift by accumulating enough evidence, because what counts as evidence is itself partly determined by the paradigm you're operating in. The shift happens when a new generation comes along that was never fully committed to the old framework, or when the crisis becomes so acute that even the committed can no longer ignore it. The old paradigm doesn't get refuted, it gets abandoned. Often, its most committed defenders die, still committed to it. This was Kuhn's most disturbing finding, and the one most relevant to the question of what to do when your own map stops matching the territory. The connection to Hegel is not incidental. Kuhn was describing in the specific domain of scientific knowledge precisely the dialectical pattern from part 1, but with a crucial addition. The paradigm is the thesis. It contains within itself, from the beginning, the seeds of its own negation. Every successful framework generates the anomalies that will eventually overwhelm it. Normal science, by solving puzzles within the paradigm, also systematically maps the paradigm's edges, and therefore, inadvertently, its limits. The more thoroughly you explore a framework, the more precisely you locate the places where it breaks down. The crisis is the antithesis. The accumulated anomalies reach a critical mass. The quantitative buildup of unresolved problems produces a qualitative shift in the field's self-understanding, from confidence to uncertainty, from puzzle solving to framework questioning. The new paradigm is the synthesis. It doesn't simply discard the old framework. In the Hegelian sense, it sublates it, preserves what was genuinely explanatory, cancels what was limiting, and elevates the whole enterprise to a new level of sophistication. Newtonian mechanics wasn't proven wrong by relativity. It was revealed as a special case, accurate within a certain range of velocities and scales, embedded within a broader framework that explained why it worked where it worked and failed where it failed. But here is Kuhn's addition to Hegel, and it's the one that matters most for the personal application. The people most deeply invested in the thesis are the least capable of navigating the synthesis. This is not a reflection of their intelligence. Their intelligence has been shaped by the thesis. Their intuitions about what looks like a good explanation, what feels like progress, what seems like a real problem versus an apparent one, all of that has been formed within the paradigm they need to exit. The framework constitutes not merely what they believe, but how they think. This is the room full of mirrors. And you don't need to be a 19th century physicist committed to the luminiferous aether to find yourself in it. Let's make this concrete in the places where it actually shows up in a life. Think about someone who spent 15 years building a career in a specific industry, developing expertise within a specific professional culture, organizing their sense of competence and identity around a specific set of skills and relationships and assumptions about how value gets created and rewarded. That constitutes a paradigm rather than just a job. It's a framework that makes professional experience legible, that tells you what a good opportunity looks like, what a warning sign looks like, who the credible voices are, what kind of work is worth doing, and then the industry shifts, not in ways that are easy to see from inside it, because the paradigm determines what counts as significant change. The anomalies arrive gradually. A few contracts that don't come through the expected channels. A few conversations where the vocabulary seems subtly different. A few younger practitioners who seem to be operating by different rules and somehow thriving. Normal science handles these easily at first. Explanations multiply. The economy is weird right now. Those people got lucky. That's not really the same field. But the anomalies keep coming. And at some point, the patches become more elaborate than what they're protecting. The person who can name this, who can say my paradigm is in crisis, and that is a different and more interesting problem rather than I am failing, is in a position to do something about it. The person who can't name it will keep applying the tools of the old framework with increasing intensity. Bewildered that harder work keeps producing diminishing returns. This is not a failure of effort or intelligence. It is the precise experience that Kuhn described in the history of science, playing out at the scale of a single professional life. And the first move, the move that makes everything else possible, is recognizing which kind of problem you're actually facing. The political and economic version of this is harder to talk about honestly, because it implicates not just careers, but identities. The frameworks through which people understand their place in the social order, their relationship to institutions, their basic story about how the world works and how it's supposed to work. The sense that the systems trusted to hold things together are visibly straining. That feeling from part 1, the 2 a.m. feeling, is in significant part the experience of a paradigm in crisis. The post-war framework in Western democracies, the broad set of assumptions about institutions, expertise, economic growth, and social mobility that structured public life for decades, has been accumulating anomalies for a long time. Wages that stopped tracking productivity. Institutions that kept their authority long after losing the performance that justified it. Expert consents that was wrong in expensive and visible ways. The social contract whose terms kept quietly changing while the language describing it stayed the same. Normal science handled these for a long time. Explanations multiplied. Each anomaly got its epicycle, but you cannot patch indefinitely. And what looks like political chaos, the simultaneous collapse of confidence in institutions across the political spectrum, the proliferation of incompatible frameworks, all claiming to explain the same reality, is what a paradigm crisis looks like at a civilizational scale. Kuhn is clarifying here, not comforting. He's not saying that a new and better paradigm is definitely coming, or that it will arrive on schedule, or that the transition will be managed well. What he is saying is that this specific texture of confusion, where the old explanations no longer satisfy, where multiple incompatible frameworks compete, where foundational questions that seemed settled keep getting reopened, is recognizable. It has happened before. It has a structure. And understanding the structure doesn't resolve the crisis, but it does change your relationship to it. The worst thing you can do inside a paradigm crisis, whether it's your career, your relationship, or your political world, is to redouble your commitment to the old framework in the face of its failure. This response reflects neither stubbornness nor stupidity. It's the most natural cognitive response available, and it's available precisely because the paradigm shapes what feels like a reasonable response. From inside a failing framework, working harder within the framework always feels more reasonable than questioning the framework itself. The second worst thing is to conclude from the crisis that no framework is possible. That since the old map was wrong, maps are inherently deceptive and you're better off without one. This is the cynicism that Part 2 addressed in the context of expertise. It mistakes the failure of a particular framework for the impossibility of frameworks as such, and it leaves you navigating without instruments in conditions that require them. So what does the alternative actually look like? Kuhn's History of Science offers a partial answer. The people who navigated paradigm shifts most successfully were not the ones who saw the new framework fully formed from the beginning. Almost no one does. They were the ones who could hold the anomalies honestly, without forcing premature resolution in either direction. They didn't explain the anomalies away. They also didn't immediately conclude that everything they knew was worthless. They sat with the productive discomfort of a framework under stress, staying curious about what the anomalies were pointing toward, remaining open to the possibility that the next explanatory structure would preserve much of what they'd learnt while reconfiguring its meaning. Translated into practice, this looks like a specific set of questions you can bring to any situation where the old map is failing. The first question: what are the anomalies I've been explaining away? Not the obvious problems, those you've been working on, the quiet ones. The results that didn't fit that you attributed to bad luck or bad timing. The conversations that felt subtly off, that you filed under, they just don't get it. The predictions your framework made that didn't come true, that you've quietly stopped mentioning. These are your data. They're telling you where the framework is straining, and the fact that you've been managing them rather than investigating them is itself significant. The second question: what would this look like from inside a different framework? This is genuinely hard because the whole problem with paradigms is that alternative frameworks feel not just wrong, but illegible from inside the current one. But you can approximate it. Find someone whose results are different from yours and who can't be explained away as lucky. Try to understand the world from their assumptions, not to adopt those assumptions, but to understand what they make visible that your current framework obscures. The anomalies your framework dismisses as noise are often precisely the signal that a different framework is organized around. The third question: what in my current framework is actually working, and what is load-bearing only in the sense that I have built my identity around it? This is the most personal of the three, and the most difficult, because paradigms are not just cognitive, they're emotional. They're attached to investments of time and energy and self-concept. Some of what you've built is genuinely valuable and will survive into whatever framework comes next. Some of it is defended, not because it's working, but because abandoning it would require revising the story you tell about yourself. Distinguishing between those two categories is the work. Nobody can do it for you, and there is no neutral position from which to do it. You're always doing it from inside some framework. But asking the question persistently and honestly is different from not asking it. Here is the thing about paradigm shifts that Kuhn observed and that the official story of scientific progress tends to omit. They feel, from the inside, like loss before they feel like discovery. The old framework wasn't just wrong, it was functional. It organized experience, generated predictions that were often right, made it possible to act in the world with reasonable confidence. Losing it, even when it has manifestly failed, even when the anomalies have become impossible to ignore, involves mourning something real. The person who walks out of a career paradigm that no longer works doesn't just gain a new framework, they lose the one that organized 15 years of their life. The person who exits a political paradigm that has failed them doesn't just gain a more accurate picture of the world, they lose the one in which their choices and commitments made a certain kind of sense. This is not a weakness, it is the appropriate response to a real loss. And it is also, if the pattern holds, the experience that precedes the possibility of something new. Cohn's scientists, emerging from crises into a new paradigm, consistently reported something that reads less like intellectual triumph than like perceptual reconfiguration. The experience of the same data suddenly snapping into a new shape, of problems that had been intractable dissolving because the new framework revealed them as artifacts of the old. One's assumptions, the world didn't change, the lens did, and with the lens, everything. That shift cannot be forced, it cannot be scheduled, it cannot be produced by trying harder within the failing framework. What it can be produced by is the honest, sustained, uncomfortable work of sitting with the anomalies instead of managing them, of letting the crisis be a crisis instead of a temporary setback in an otherwise functional system. That is harder than it sounds, especially when you're alone with your thoughts, especially when the anomalies are your life. But the alternative, the room full of mirrors, the framework defending itself against the evidence that would free you, is harder still. Here is something that happened in the history of science that should unsettle you more than it probably does. In the early 20th century, two groups of physicists were working on the same experimental data, the behavior of subatomic particles, and arrived at two completely different mathematical frameworks to explain it. Werner Heisenberg developed matrix mechanics. Erwin Schrödinger developed wave mechanics. The two theories were mathematically different, conceptually different, and based on almost opposite intuitions about what was physically happening at the quantum level. Heisenberg thought in terms of discrete jumps between states. Schrödinger thought in terms of continuous waves. They were both right. Or more precisely, both frameworks made identical predictions about every experiment that could be devised to distinguish between them. The same data, the same observational record, the same physical reality, and two genuinely different theoretical structures sitting on top of it, neither of which could be dislodged by any evidence, because both accommodated all the evidence equally well. This is the underdetermination problem. It has a formal philosophical statement. The philosopher W.V.O. Quine argued that any body of evidence is always logically compatible with infinitely many theories, and that our choice between them is always guided by factors that go beyond the evidence itself. But its implications extend so far beyond physics that they eventually reach the story you're telling right now about why your life looks the way it does. Well, let's start with the philosophical scaffolding and then dismantle it into something you can actually use. Quine's insight, which he developed in a 1951 paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, was that scientific theories don't face the tribunal of experience one by one. They face it as a corporate body. When you run an experiment, you're not just testing a single hypothesis. You're simultaneously testing the hypothesis, the theory it's embedded in, the background assumptions about how your instruments work, the auxiliary beliefs about what variables are being held constant, and a dozen other commitments you didn't even know you were making. When the result comes back unexpected, logic alone cannot tell you which part of that entire structure is wrong. It could be the hypothesis. It could be an assumption about the instruments. It could be one of the background beliefs you weren't even consciously aware of holding. This is not a defect in scientific reasoning. It's a structural feature of the relationship between theory and evidence. Evidence constrains which stories you can tell. It eliminates some possibilities, but it never narrows the field down to exactly one. The gap between what the evidence requires and what the theory claims is always bridged by choices about simplicity, about coherence with other things you believe, about what kinds of explanations feel satisfying, about what questions seem worth asking. Pierre Duhem, the French physicist who identified this problem before Quine formalized it, put it plainly: you can always save a theory from disconfirmation by adjusting the auxiliary assumptions. The question is never simply, does the evidence fit the theory? The question is always, which adjustment should which part of the system is most rational, given everything else we believe? And that question has no purely logical answer. Now, hold that thought, and think about the last significant thing that went wrong in your life. Something ended. A relationship, a job, a belief about how things were going, a sense of security you'd been living inside without fully noticing it was there. And in the aftermath, maybe immediately, maybe slowly, over weeks, a narrative formed. A story about what happened, why it happened, whose choices led where, what it means about you and about the world. That story felt like a discovery, like you were finally seeing clearly what had been obscured, like the evidence had spoken. But here is what the underdetermination problem reveals, with uncomfortable precision. The story was not discovered. It was chosen. Not arbitrarily. The evidence constrained your options, eliminated some narratives, made others more or less plausible. But within the space the evidence left open, something other than evidence made the final selection. Your prior beliefs about how the world works. Your tolerance for particular kinds of self-implication. Your emotional needs in the immediate aftermath of loss. The frameworks you'd inherited from your family, your culture, the last book you read, the friend you called first. The same set of facts about an ended relationship supports, without logical contradiction, at least these completely different narratives that you chose badly and should have known better. That you chose well, but circumstances changed in ways nobody could have predicted. That the relationship was structurally flawed from the beginning. That it was genuinely good and ran its natural course. That one person failed the other. That both people failed each other. That neither person failed, and failure is the wrong category entirely. Each of these narratives implies different lessons, different adjustments, different versions of yourself going forward. And none of them is simply read off the evidence. All of them are, to a greater or lesser degree, constructed. This is not relativism. Some of these narratives are better supported than others. Some of them are more honest about the evidence, more coherent with the full range of what happened, less reliant on convenient omissions. The underdetermination problem does not mean that all stories are equally valid. It means that validity is not the only criterion at work when we choose between them, and that we are almost always unaware of the other criteria we're applying. Quine described the web of belief as exactly that, a web, not a hierarchy. At the center are the beliefs most deeply embedded, most thoroughly connected to everything else, most costly to revise. At the periphery are the beliefs most directly in contact with experience, most easily updated when the evidence changes. When experience produces a result that conflicts with the web, you have choices about where to absorb the shock. You can revise a peripheral belief, a specific prediction, a minor assumption, and leave the center intact. Or you can allow the disruption to propagate inward, toward the beliefs that are more fundamental, more identity constituting, more expensive to change. We almost always choose the first option, not because we're intellectually dishonest, but because the center of the web is where we live. The deep beliefs about what kind of person we are, what we deserve, how the world is organized, what kinds of futures are available to us, are not just beliefs. They're the infrastructure of experience itself. Revising them isn't like changing your mind about a fact. It's more like renovation while you're still living in the building. But here is the dialectical pressure that the underdetermination problem introduces. The choice of where to absorb the shock is itself a consequential act, and the consequences accumulate. Every time you revise the peripheral belief and protect the central one, you're making a bet. The bet is that the central belief is load-bearing in the right way, that it's organizing your experience accurately rather than just comfortably. Sometimes that bet is correct. Sometimes the peripheral revision is exactly right, and the core framework that survived the disruption is genuinely valid and worth protecting. But sometimes, and this is the thing that is hard to see from inside the web, the peripheral revisions are epicycles. They're patches. They're the Baroque elaborations that Part 2 identified as the signature of a framework, defending itself against falsification rather than engaging honestly with evidence. The question that the underdetermination problem forces you to ask, and that nobody around you is likely to ask on your behalf, because they're busy managing their own webs, is this: am I revising the right thing? When the relationship ended, did you update your understanding of that specific relationship, or did you update your understanding of relationships as such? When the job disappeared, did you revise your assessment of that specific role and company? Or did you revise your model of how professional value gets created and recognized? When the institution failed you, did you update your beliefs about that institution? Or about what institutions can and cannot be trusted to do? None of these is automatically the right level of revision. Sometimes the peripheral update is exactly correct. Sometimes the central framework genuinely needs to change. The problem is that we are constitutionally disposed to update at the most peripheral level available, because that's the level that least disturbs the infrastructure we're living in, and that disposition, operating without examination, means we systematically under-revise the beliefs that most need revising. There is a specific emotional experience that tends to accompany the moment when under-revision becomes impossible to sustain. It's not the experience of being proved wrong. It's the experience of suddenly seeing that a story you've been telling has been doing work. You didn't know you were assigning it. You realize you've been narrating your professional life as a story of underappreciated competence. And the realization arrives not as an argument, but as a kind of nauseating recognition that the narrative has been selecting which evidence to weight, that the moments of confirmation are vivid and the moments of disconfirmation are dim, and that someone with access to all the same facts could construct a completely different and equally coherent account. Or you realize that the story you've been telling about a relationship, about who was generous and who was withholding, who showed up and who retreated, has been built on a principle of selection that you designed, unconsciously, to reach a predetermined conclusion. This experience is not the same as deciding you were wrong. It's more vertiginous than that. It's the recognition that the evidence never determined the story, that the story was always being authored, and that you have been both the author and the character without fully knowing it. Philosophers call this the theory-ladenness of observation. We do not perceive raw data and then interpret it. We perceive through interpretive frameworks that are already in place, and those frameworks determine what we notice, what we remember, what feels significant, and what fades. There is no view from nowhere. There is no story that is just the facts. This could be, and often is, experienced as a form of groundlessness. If the story is always constructed, if the evidence always underdetermines the narrative, if there is no position from which to simply read off what happened and what it means, then what? Here is where the dialectical move becomes not just analytically useful, but something close to necessary. The thesis, stories are discovered. Evidence speaks. The narrative that forms after something happens is, if you're honest and careful, a direct report of reality. The antithesis, stories are constructed. Evidence underdetermines. The narrative is always shaped by factors that go beyond the evidence, and the confidence with which it's held is not proportional to its accuracy. Both of these positions taken alone are inhabitable but costly. The first produces false certainty and systematic revision. The second, taken to its limit, produces paralysis. If the story is always constructed, why commit to any of them? Why not remain permanently suspended in a cloud of equally valid narratives? The synthesis is neither. It is the recognition that constructed does not mean arbitrary, and that authorship is not the same as fiction. When you build a house, you're making choices. The architecture is not dictated by the laws of physics alone. 1,000 different structures are physically possible, but some structures are more stable, more functional, more appropriate to the terrain and the climate and the needs of the people who will live there. The fact that it was designed doesn't make it less real. The fact that choices were made in its construction doesn't mean all choices are equally good. A narrative works the same way. The fact that you're authoring it doesn't make it arbitrary. It makes you responsible for authoring it well. And authoring a narrative well means something specific. It means holding it with enough looseness that it can be revised when the evidence demands revision. Being honest about which parts are load-bearing observation and which parts are interpretive framework. And most importantly, being willing to ask the question that the underdetermination problem makes available. What other story does this evidence support? Not as an exercise in self-undermining, but as a genuine act of investigation. What would someone who loved you and was completely honest with you see in the same set of facts? What would someone who had no stake in your preferred narrative conclude? What does the evidence look like if you bracket the interpretation that arrived first and ask what else it's compatible with? This question has a specific application to the current historical moment that is worth naming directly. The overwhelming problems that arrive through the news, the political dysfunction, the economic precarity, the institutional failures, the sense that the systems holding things together are straining past their limits. All of these are being narrated constantly by people and institutions with stakes in particular narratives. The underdetermination problem is not a neutral philosophical observation in this context. It is the operating principle of the entire information environment you're living in. The same economic data supports the narrative that the system is working with localized failures, and the narrative that the system is failing with localized successes. The same political events support the narrative that institutions are resilient and self-correcting, and the narrative that they are captured and no longer capable of correction. The same technological developments support the narrative of democratized opportunity and the narrative of accelerated inequality. None of these pairs is symmetric. The evidence does more work in some directions than others, and intellectual honesty requires attending to that asymmetry. But the point is not that all narratives are equally valid. The point is that the narrative you've absorbed about what is happening and why is not simply what the evidence shows. It is what the evidence shows, plus the frameworks, prior beliefs, emotional needs, and institutional interests that shaped how the evidence was selected and presented to you. The practice this calls for is not skepticism about everything. It's a specific habit. Before accepting a narrative about a complex situation, especially one that confirms what you already believed, especially one that arrives with emotional force, especially one that casts the people you distrust as villains and the people you trust as victims. Ask what other story the same evidence supports, and why you're not hearing that story from the same source. That question will not always destabilize the original narrative. Sometimes the original narrative survives serious examination, but the examination itself is the practice. It's the difference between a story you've received and a story you've chosen. And choosing, even when you choose something close to what you would have accepted passively, is a different relationship to the narrative. It's the relationship of an author who knows their writing, rather than a character who thinks the plot is simply happening to them. You are always writing the story. The question is whether you know it. Knowing it does not make the story less true. It does not make the losses smaller, or the problems less real, or the things that ended less gone. The underdetermination problem is not a consolation. It does not arrive with comfort attached. What it arrives with is something more durable: agency. Not the agency of controlling what happens, which was never available. The agency of choosing, with some degree of consciousness and care, what the things that happen mean, what they imply about where you've been, what they make possible about where you're going, what they demand by way of revision, and what they leave intact. That is the authorship that was always yours. You were exercising it anyway, without knowing. The only question the underdetermination problem puts to you is whether you'd like to exercise it with your eyes open. The evidence, as always, leaves that choice underdetermined. It's yours to make. There is a mathematician's joke that goes like this: a Bayesian is someone who, upon being told that a horse just won a race, immediately updates their prior probability that horses exist. It's funny because it's absurd, but the absurdity points at something real. A way of relating to beliefs that most people find genuinely alien when they first encounter it, and quietly devastating when they actually try to practice it. The idea is this: instead of holding beliefs as things you have or don't have, true or false, yours or not yours, you hold them as probabilities, degrees of confidence distributed across possibilities, constantly in motion as new evidence arrives. You are never certain. You are never completely ignorant. You are always somewhere on a spectrum. And the practice of good thinking is the practice of moving along that spectrum in the right direction by the right amount in response to the right evidence. This sounds clean, academic even. A useful tool for scientists and statisticians and people who enjoy arguing about epistemology at dinner parties. Then you try to actually do it with something that matters. You try to do it with the belief that you chose the right career, or that your relationship is fundamentally sound, or that the political framework you've organized your civic identity around is still the most accurate map of how power actually works. You try to update your confidence in those beliefs in proportion to the evidence, without identity collapse, without the kind of defensive certainty that closes off new information, and without the kind of radical doubt that makes action impossible. And you discover that Bayesian reasoning is not primarily an intellectual practice. It is an emotional one, and the emotions it runs into are not incidental obstacles. They are the whole problem. Thomas Bayes was an 18th century English minister who never published his most important idea during his lifetime. His friend Richard Price found it among his papers after his death and submitted it to the Royal Society in 1763. The paper was a response to a problem David Hume had raised about induction, about whether repeated observations could ever rationally justify confidence in a general principle. And it offered a mathematical framework for exactly that question. The core of Bayes' theorem is simple enough to state in a sentence. Your confidence in a hypothesis after seeing evidence should be proportional to how likely the evidence would be if the hypothesis were true, weighted by how plausible the hypothesis was before you saw any evidence at all. That prior plausibility, the prior in the technical language, is where everything interesting and difficult lives. Because here is the thing about priors: they are not neutral. They are not empty vessels waiting to be filled by evidence. They are the accumulated residue of everything you've experienced, everything you've been taught, every framework you've absorbed, every theory you've found useful or useless. They are, in the language of Part 3, your paradigm. And they determine, as much as any incoming evidence, what you conclude. Bayesian, who starts with a very strong prior that vaccines cause harm, will look at the same clinical trial data as a Bayesian who starts with a strong prior that vaccines are safe, and both of them, updating correctly on the same evidence, will end up with very different posterior beliefs. This is not irrational. It is the mathematically correct behavior given their starting points. The question of which prior is more justified is a prior question. A question about the entire history of evidence and reasoning that led to each starting point. And it is a question that Bayes' theorem itself cannot answer. This is either deeply reassuring or deeply disturbing, depending on what you were hoping rationality would do for you. Let's approach this from a different direction, through a story about what Bayesian updating feels like from the inside when it's working, and what it feels like when it isn't. Imagine you've held a belief for a long time that you are, fundamentally, not someone who is good at sustained relationships. Maybe this belief formed from early experience. Maybe it was reinforced by a series of relationships that ended badly. Maybe it has the texture of hard-won self-knowledge, the kind of thing you say with a certain rueful authority, the kind of thing you've made peace with. That belief is a prior, and like all priors, it is not neutral. It shapes what you notice. When a relationship goes well, the prior is there, quietly suggesting that this is the exception, the anomaly, the honeymoon period before the pattern reasserts itself. When it goes badly, the prior is there, confirmed again, the evidence neatly absorbed. The prior is doing exactly what priors do. It is organizing your experience, making certain interpretations feel natural and others feel like motivated reasoning. Now, evidence arrives that should update the prior. A relationship that has lasted longer than any previous one. A pattern of repair after conflict that is new in your experience. A person who seems to respond to your specific difficulties in ways that previous people couldn't. This is data. It points, if you're applying Bayesian reasoning, toward an upward revision of your estimate of your own relational capacity. But here is what actually happens, and what Bayes' theorem cannot capture. The prior doesn't update smoothly. It defends itself. It generates alternative explanations for the disconfirming evidence. It attributes the success to the other person's exceptional qualities rather than any change in you. It maintains a background hum of expectation that the pattern will eventually reassert itself. It treats positive evidence as less informative than negative evidence. A well-documented asymmetry in human cognition called negativity bias that operates entirely below the level of conscious reasoning. This is not stupidity. It is the mind doing what the mind evolved to do, protecting its model of the world from the metabolic expense of constant revision. Priors exist because updating is costly. The prior is your brain's way of saying, we've paid for this belief already. Let's not pay again unless we absolutely have to. The problem is that absolutely have to is a threshold that self-serving reasoning can raise indefinitely. Daniel Kahneman, whose decades of research on judgment and decision-making earned him a Nobel Prize, spent much of his career documenting the specific ways human beings fail to approximate Bayesian reasoning. The failures are not random. They cluster around predictable biases. We overweight vivid, recent, emotionally resonant evidence. We underweight abstract, statistical, base rate information. We seek confirming evidence for beliefs we already hold and are less motivated to seek disconfirming evidence. We update asymmetrically, more resistant to revising upward on things we believe are bad about ourselves, more resistant to revising downward on things we believe are good. But Kahneman's research also revealed something that is less often emphasized in the popular summaries. The biases are not simply errors to be corrected by better information. They are structural features of the cognitive architecture, and many of them are functional in specific contexts. The negativity bias exists because, in evolutionary history, the cost of underestimating a threat was almost always higher than the cost of overestimating one. The confirmation bias exists because in a world where information is costly to gather, focusing your search on evidence that can meaningfully update your existing model is often more efficient than searching randomly. The problem is not the biases themselves. The problem is that the contexts in which they're functional and the contexts in which they're destructive have become harder to distinguish. You're running cognitive software optimized from an environment that no longer exists, in an information environment that is specifically designed to exploit the biases rather than correct for them. And the beliefs that most need updating, the ones at the center of Quine's web, the ones that the previous essay identified as structurally protected from revision, are precisely the ones the biases are most powerfully organized to defend. So what does it actually look like to do this better? Not perfectly, not with the clean elegance of a mathematical theorem updating in response to data. Actually, in the middle of a life, with real beliefs about real things that carry real emotional weight. The first thing to understand is that Bayesian reasoning is not primarily a technique for reaching correct conclusions. It is primarily a technique for maintaining the right relationship to your own uncertainty. The goal is not to arrive at a specific belief. The goal is to hold whatever beliefs you have with a degree of confidence that is proportional to the evidence, and to remain genuinely open to revision, not performatively open, not open in the way that allows you to say, "I could be wrong," while behaving as if you couldn't be, but structurally open in a way that your beliefs actually move when the evidence moves. That structural openness requires something that feels, from the inside, less like an intellectual stance and more like a physical practice. It requires regularly, deliberately asking, "What would change my mind about this?" Part 2 introduced this question in the context of evaluating other people's claims. Here the application is more intimate and more difficult. What evidence, if it arrived, would lead you to revise your estimate of your own competence in the domain where you most want to believe you're capable? What would cause you to update your assessment of a relationship you've heavily invested in? What would move you on a political or social belief that is currently deeply entangled with your identity and your community? If you cannot answer these questions, if the honest answer is "nothing would change my mind about this," that is important information. Not necessarily that the belief is wrong, but that you are no longer holding it as a belief in the Bayesian sense. You are holding it as an axiom, an identity commitment, a non-negotiable premise. And non-negotiable premises, as Part 3 established, are the contents of paradigms, which means they will only be revised, if ever, through the painful crisis process rather than the smooth updating process. The practical move is to lower that threshold deliberately, in advance, before the crisis arrives. This has a direct application to the specific overwhelm of the current historical moment that is worth dwelling on. One of the most disorienting features of the present is the sheer volume of confident claims competing for your credence. The news cycle, the social media environment, the podcast ecosystem, all of them are running on an attention economy that rewards confidence over calibration. The person who says, "I think there's roughly a 60% chance this policy will have the effect its proponents claim," conditional on a set of background assumptions that could go various ways, does not get shared. The person who says this will definitely fix everything, or this is obviously a disaster does. The incentive structure systematically selects for expressed certainty at the expense of accurate uncertainty. The result is that you are marinating constantly in beliefs held at confidence levels that have been inflated far beyond what the evidence supports. And because the beliefs are expressed with such certainty, and because they arrive from people who seem knowledgeable and authoritative, the implicit invitation is to adopt them at the same confidence level, to absorb not just the content, but the certainty. Bayesian reasoning, applied here, is an act of resistance. Not the cynical resistance of dismissing all claims equally, which is what Part 2 warned against, but the structural resistance of asking, every time a confident claim arrives, what is the actual evidence for this? What are the background assumptions? What confidence level would be genuinely appropriate? And am I being invited to hold this belief more firmly than the evidence warrants? That question slows things down. It creates friction in a system that is designed for frictionless transmission of certainty, and that friction is not a bug, it is the practice. There is a deeper problem that Bayesian reasoning surfaces, one that the mathematics cannot resolve, and that sits at the intersection of epistemology and identity. The beliefs we most need to update are almost always the ones most tightly bound to whom we understand ourselves to be. Not the peripheral beliefs, those update easily, sometimes too easily, blown around by every new piece of evidence. The central ones, the beliefs about what we're capable of, what we deserve, what kinds of futures are available to us, what the world owes us and what we owe it. These beliefs are not just held, they are inhabited. They are the rooms we live in. Revising them is not like changing your mind. It is more like moving and moving, even when where you're going is better. Even when where you've been has become genuinely untenable, involves loss. The loss of the familiar. The loss of the story that made sense of the past. The loss of the community of people who share the prior, who will experience your revision as a kind of betrayal, or at minimum as an unsettling reminder that their own prior might also be revisable. This is why changing your mind is so much harder than it sounds. It is not primarily an intellectual challenge. It is a social and emotional one. And any honest account of Bayesian reasoning as a practice has to contend with that reality rather than abstracting it away. What helps, not as a guarantee, but as a genuine partial mitigation, is decoupling your identity from the specific content of your beliefs and attaching it instead to the practice of holding beliefs well. This is the move. Instead of building your sense of self around being the person who holds a particular set of views, you build it around being the person who holds views in a particular way, with calibrated confidence, with genuine openness to revision, with the intellectual honesty to say, I was wrong about this, and here is how my thinking has changed and why. The content of your beliefs becomes less load-bearing. The quality of your epistemic practice becomes the thing you're protecting. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult because the culture does not reward it. The culture rewards confident, consistent identity constituting belief. Updating is framed as weakness, as inconsistency, as being manipulated. Holding a view with appropriate uncertainty is framed as not really believing anything. The Bayesian virtues, calibration, openness, honest acknowledgement of what you don't know, are systematically punished in most of the public arenas where beliefs get performed, which means practicing them is, among other things, an act of quiet resistance to a culture that has decided that certainty is a personality and uncertainty is a character flaw. Here is where Hegel returns, because he always returns when you're thinking seriously about change. The dialectic from part 1 described how systems develop through the tension of opposing forces. Applied to the problem of belief revision, the thesis is naive certainty, beliefs held without awareness of their constructed nature, priors defended as if they were observations, identity fully fused with specific positions. The antithesis is radical doubt, the recognition, arrived at through crisis or philosophical reflection, that all beliefs are constructed, all priors are contestable, no position is simply read off reality. The synthesis, which is what Bayesian reasoning, practiced honestly, actually is, holds both. It takes the antithesis seriously. Yes, all beliefs are probabilistic, all priors are constructed, all certainty is calibrated. And it refuses the paralysis of radical doubt. Within that recognition, you still act, still commit, still hold views and make decisions and build a life. You simply do it with a different relationship to the views you hold. not fusion, not detachment, something more like what the philosopher Michael Polonia called personal knowledge. Committed, active, fully engaged with the belief, while retaining the structural capacity to revise it. That synthesis is harder to inhabit than either the thesis or the antithesis. The thesis is comfortable. The antithesis is, paradoxically, also comfortable in its own way. Radical doubt exempts you from the difficulty of actual commitment. The synthesis requires you to be fully in and fully open at the same time. That is not a stable resting place. It is a practice, a daily, imperfect, sometimes failing practice of holding what you believe with enough firmness to act on it and enough looseness to let it move when the evidence demands. The prior you brought to this essay is not the same prior you'll carry away from it. If it is, one of us hasn't been doing the work. The question, and it is always the question, is whether the revision is by the right amount, in the right direction, for the right reasons. That question never fully closes. That's not a flaw in the method. It's the method in 2011. A psychologist named Daryl Bem published a paper in one of the most prestigious journals in his field. The paper was methodologically rigorous by every standard the field recognized. It had been peer-reviewed, it had large sample sizes, it reported statistically significant results across 9 separate experiments. The paper argued that people could perceive future events before they happened, not metaphonically, not as a loose claim about intuition or pattern recognition, literally. That research participants performed better than chance at tasks when the correct answer was determined randomly after they gave their response. That practicing a list of words improved your ability to recall different words from the same list. Words you hadn't studied yet, words you would only encounter later. Precognition. In the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the field reacted with alarm. Not primarily because the conclusion was outlandish, though it was, but because of what the alarm forced everyone to confront. If Bem's study was methodologically sound by existing standards, and his conclusions were obviously wrong, then either the standards were broken or something had gone very wrong in how psychology produced and validated knowledge. A group of researchers immediately attempted to replicate his findings. They couldn't. Then they started replicating other findings. Classic landmark textbook findings. Findings that had been taught to undergraduates for decades, that had shaped therapeutic practice and policy and public understanding of how human minds work. Many of them failed to replicate too. What followed was called the replication crisis. It turned out to be not a crisis in psychology alone, but across significant portions of social science, medicine, nutrition research, and cancer biology. A 2015 project that attempted to reproduce 100 published psychology studies found that fewer than half produced results consistent with the original. A review of landmark studies in cancer biology found that the majority could not be reproduced. Findings about ego depletion, the idea that willpower is a limited resource that gets exhausted, largely failed to replicate. The Power Pose research, which had generated a massively viewed TED Talk and found its way into corporate training programs worldwide, failed to replicate. Priming effects, wherein exposure to certain words or concepts unconsciously shapes subsequent behavior, proved far weaker and less reliable than the original literature suggested. The crisis did not mean that all of psychology was wrong. It meant that a substantial portion of what had been presented as established knowledge was, in some important sense, not that. It meant that the systems designed to produce reliable knowledge had been producing something else. Findings shaped by subtle incentive structures, publication biases, flexible analytical choices, and the simple human desire to find something interesting and calling it science. And if you had built parts of your understanding of yourself, your relationships, or your institutional practices on those findings, you were standing on ground that turned out to be less solid than advertised. This is where this essay begins, not with a philosophical problem, but with a practical one. What do you do with knowledge you can no longer fully trust when you still have to act? The replication crisis did not arrive from nowhere. It was, in the dialectical sense established in Part 1, a negation that the original thesis had been generating for decades. The thesis was a particular model of how scientific knowledge gets produced and validated. You run a study, you analyze the data. If the result clears a statistical threshold, the famous p-value of less than 0.05, meaning roughly that there's less than a 1 in 20 chance the result occurred by chance, you found something. You publish it. Other researchers build on it. The edifice of knowledge grows. This model contained within itself, invisibly, the seeds of its own failure. The statistical threshold was never as meaningful as its use implied. A PBA value of 0.05 means that if there is no real effect, you'd still expect a false positive 1 time in 20. When thousands of researchers are running thousands of studies, testing dozens of hypotheses each, a substantial proportion of published findings will be false positives by sheer arithmetic. Even assuming perfect methodological honesty, which there was no particular reason to assume. More corrosively, the publication system created what statisticians call the file drawer problem. Studies that found significant results got published. Studies that found nothing got filed away. This meant that published literature was systematically biased toward positive findings, and the 1 in 20 false positive rate was being calculated against a denominator that nobody could see. The studies that would have contextualized and qualified the published findings were invisible, sitting in file drawers because journals had little interest in null results. And layered on top of that was a set of flexible analytical practices that researched Andrew Gelman called the Garden of Forking Paths. In a complex data set, there are many legitimate choices to make, which variables to include, how to handle outliers, when to stop collecting data, how to define the key outcome measure. None of these choices is necessarily dishonest, but each one is a fork, and the accumulative effect of choosing, consciously or unconsciously, the forks most likely to produce a significant result. A practiced Gelman's colleague called p-hacking inflates false positive rates dramatically without anyone necessarily behaving with explicit bad faith. The system was producing unreliable knowledge not primarily because researchers were lying, but because it had created a set of incentives and structural conditions under which unreliable knowledge was the predictable output. The antithesis, the replication crisis, was not an accident. It was the quantitative buildup of structural problems reaching a qualitative threshold. Here is the part that is hardest to sit with. The people who built their practices, their therapies, their corporate training programs, their parenting approaches, their self-understanding on findings that turned out not to replicate, were not foolish. They were doing what you're supposed to do. They were deferring to expertise. They were following the evidence. They were trusting the systems designed specifically to produce trustworthy knowledge, and those systems failed them. This failure sits differently depending on what was built on it. If you adopted a management technique based on priming research that didn't replicate, the cost is moderate, some wasted training time, some misdirected effort. If you structured your understanding of your own psychology around findings about ego, depletion, or self-control, or the malleability of implicit bias that turned out to be much less robust than claimed, the cost is harder to calculate. The self-knowledge you developed, the interventions you applied, the explanations you reached for, all of it was built on a model that was less reliable than advertised. And if you extended this trust to medical research, to nutritional science, to pharmaceutical studies, domains where the failures of replication have direct consequences for bodies, the cost can be measured in ways that don't permit abstraction. The question that follows is not primarily an intellectual one. It is a practical and emotional one. How do you rebuild a functional relationship with expertise after this? Not abandonment of it. We've been through that problem in part 2. But also not the naive restoration of the trust that was damaged. Something more appropriate to the actual situation. Popper's falsifiability criterion from part 2 gives you one tool, a finding that was never seriously tested for replication, was never as well established as its publication implied. The absence of replication attempts was itself a kind of epistemic warning sign, invisible in the moment, but retrospectively obvious. Cohen's paradigm analysis from part 3 gives you another, the practices that produce the replication crises, the statistical thresholds, the publication incentives, the flexible analytical choices, were normal science operating within a paradigm. The crisis is the paradigm failing. The field is now in the uncomfortable middle period, generating new norms for pre-registration of studies, open data sharing, and replication as a condition of confidence. What emerges will be more reliable. But the transition is real, and the knowledge produced during the period of the old paradigm cannot simply be retroactively validated by the new standards. Quine's underdetermination from part 4 gives you a third. The findings that failed to replicate were always underdetermined by the evidence. The statistical significance threshold was never sufficient to nail down a specific conclusion, even when it was interpreted as doing so. The gap between what the data showed and what the conclusions claimed was always bridged by assumptions about effect size, about the generalizability of convenience samples, about the stability of psychological phenomena across contexts that were rarely made explicit and never adequately tested. But these tools taken together still leave you with the fundamental problem. You have to act on something. You cannot wait for the epistemological situation to fully clarify, because it never fully clarifies. The provisional nature of knowledge is not a temporary condition to be resolved. It is the permanent condition of knowing anything, and the replication crisis has simply made that permanence visible in a particularly uncomfortable way. There is a philosophical tradition that has been thinking about this problem longer than the replication crisis has existed. It is called pragmatism, and it was developed at the end of the 19th century by a group of American philosophers, Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, who were trying to figure out what to do with the fact that certainty is unavailable, but action is required. Their answer, simplified considerably, was this: A belief is not a picture of reality that either corresponds or fails to correspond to how things actually are. A belief is a habit of action. To believe something is to be disposed to act in certain ways when relevant circumstances arise. And the criterion for evaluating a belief is not whether it perfectly captures some mind-independent truth, but whether it is a reliable guide to successful action, whether acting on it tends to produce the outcomes you're trying to produce. This is not relativism, though it is frequently misread as such. The pragmatist is not saying that truth is whatever works for you personally, or that incompatible beliefs can both be true if they both feel useful. They're saying something more precise, that the test of a belief is its consequences when acted upon across a wide range of conditions over a long enough time horizon for everyone it affects. A belief that produces good outcomes for you personally, but bad outcomes for others, or good outcomes short-term but bad outcomes long-term, fails the pragmatist's test. Applied to the aftermath of the replication crisis, pragmatism offers a reorientation that is both sobering and liberating. The question is not which psychological findings are true, in the sense of perfectly accurately describing universal human nature. The question is which findings, when acted upon in which contexts, produce reliable improvements in the outcomes I care about. This is a more modest question. It is also a more tractable one, and it changes how you relate to the expertise you're evaluating. You are not looking for certainty. You're looking for reliable enough in the domains that matter most to you, given the decisions you actually have to make. That reorientation has practical implications. It means weighting replication history heavily, a finding that has been replicated across multiple labs with different populations. Using different methodologies is not certain. Nothing is. But it is substantially more reliable than a finding that rests on a single elegant study, however well designed. The history of attempts to break a finding is the most informative thing about it, for exactly the reason Popper identified. What survives serious attempts at falsification is more trustworthy than what has never been tested. It means attending to effect sizes, not just statistical significance. A finding can be statistically significant, genuinely not a false positive, while being so small in practical terms that it provides almost no useful guidance. The replication crisis revealed that many findings were being interpreted as larger and more reliable than they were, because the statistical threshold was treated as a binary pass. Fail rather than as one piece of information among several. A small, reliable effect is more useful than a large, unreliable one. Know which you're dealing with. It means being especially cautious about findings that are elegant, counterintuitive, and immediately applicable to human behavior. These are precisely the findings that journals are most motivated to publish, that journalists are most motivated to cover, and that the motivated reasoning described in Part 5 is most likely to accept uncritically. The more a finding feels like a satisfying key that unlocks some previously mysterious aspects of human behavior, the more suspicious you should be. Not because satisfying keys don't exist, but because the incentive structure produces a surplus of fake ones, and it means building your life on portfolios rather than single findings, not staking your approach to a relationship, a career, or a psychological challenge on any single piece of research, however well credentialed, but triangulating across multiple lines of evidence, multiple frameworks, multiple sources of feedback about what is actually working in your actual life. There is a harder implication that deserves its own space, because it touches something that the philosophical frameworks alone cannot fully address. The replication crisis was not just a crisis of methodology, it was a crisis of institutional trust. The journals, the peer review process, the credentialing systems that were supposed to guarantee reliability, these did not merely fail to catch the problems. In important respects, they actively generated them through the incentive structures they created and the questions they declined to ask. This means that part of what needs rebuilding is not just your relationship with specific findings, but your relationship with the institutions that produce and certify knowledge. And that rebuilding cannot proceed naively, pretending the failure did not happen. But neither can it proceed through the wholesale abandonment of institutional knowledge that the failure sometimes tempts. The synthesis, and there is always a synthesis, even when it takes longer to arrive than you'd like, is something like calibrated institutional trust. You extend trust to institutions not because they are infallible, but because they have demonstrated specific capacities. The capacity to identify their own failures, to generate the internal criticism that produces reform, to change their practices in response to evidence of those practices' inadequacy. The replication crisis, looked at from this angle, is itself evidence of that capacity. The crisis was identified by researchers within the field. The reforms, pre-registration, open data, registered reports, adversarial collaboration, are being driven by scientists who care about getting things right more than they care about protecting the field's reputation. The crisis is the immune system functioning. It is the self-correcting mechanism operating, slowly and painfully, and imperfectly, but operating. That is not a reason to trust uncritically. It is a reason to trust differentially, to distinguish between fields and institutions that have demonstrated self-correcting capacity and those that have not, between findings that have survived the new scrutiny and those that have not, between experts who acknowledge the failures of their field and those who explain them away. Here is where this lands, practically, in the life of someone trying to navigate overwhelming problems with imperfect tools. You are always building on provisional ground. This was always true. The replication crisis did not create the provisionality of knowledge, it revealed it. The solid ground you thought you were standing on was never as solid as it felt. The question has always been not how to find certainty, but how to build well in its absence. Building well in the absence of certainty means something specific. It means investing most heavily in knowledge that has survived the most serious attempts to disconfirm it. It means holding your frameworks loosely enough to revise them when the evidence demands, while holding them firmly enough to act on them when action is required. It means maintaining a kind of epistemic portfolio, diversified across frameworks and sources, not over-indexed on any single finding or approach, hedged against the inevitable discovery that something you believed was less reliable than you thought. And it means extending yourself a specific form of grace that the crisis makes necessary and that is genuinely difficult to extend. The grace of having been wrong while doing the best you could with the information available. You built on findings that didn't replicate. You acted on expertise that turned out to be less reliable than it claimed. You trusted systems that were generating knowledge of a quality different from what they advertised. This is not stupidity. It is not negligence. It is the condition of being a person who takes evidence seriously in a world where the production of evidence is imperfect. The ground shifts. It has always shifted. What you can develop, slowly, incompletely, through exactly the process this series has been tracing, is the capacity to feel the shift before it throws you, to locate the new footing without pretending the shifting didn't happen, and to build again on ground you know is provisional. Not because you have no choice, but because provisional is all there has ever been. The sand moves, you'll build anyway. You'll build better because you know it moves. In 1927, Werner Heisenberg was trying to solve a problem that seemed, on its surface, purely technical. He wanted to know the precise position and momentum of an electron simultaneously. Position, where is it? Momentum, how fast is it moving, and in what direction? These seem like simple questions. The kind of questions you'd ask about a billiard ball, a planet, any moving object. You look, you measure, you know. But the act of measuring an electron's position requires bouncing a photon off it. And a photon, even the smallest possible one you can use, carries enough energy that the collision disturbs the electron's momentum. The more precisely you locate the electron, the shorter the wavelength of photon you use, the more precisely you pin down position, the more violently you disturb its momentum, the more gently you probe, using longer wavelengths to minimize disturbance, the less precisely you can determine where it is. This is not a limitation of instruments that better technology will eventually overcome. It is not a failure of experimental technique. It is a feature of reality itself. The uncertainty is not in your measurement, it is in the electron. The act of observation participates in constituting what is observed. Before measurement, the electron does not have a definite position and a definite momentum simultaneously. It has a probability distribution across possible states. The measurement collapses that distribution into a specific outcome, but in doing so, it irreversibly disturbs the system. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is one of the most rarefied and least intuitively graspable facts in physics. But the pattern it describes, observation disturbing the observed, is not confined to quantum mechanics. It surfaces everywhere that a system becomes aware of being watched, measured, tracked, or attended to. And it surfaces with consequences that are entirely practical and entirely personal. In the specific way that paying attention to your own mental and emotional life changes the mental and emotional life you're paying attention to. This is the observation effect. And understanding it is, right now, one of the most urgent things you can do. Start with a deceptively simple example from social science. In the 1920s, a series of studies was conducted at the Hawthorne Works, a Western electric factory near Chicago. Researchers were investigating whether changes in physical conditions, lighting levels, break schedules, the layout of workstations affected worker productivity. What they found was strange. Almost every change they made seemed to improve productivity. When they increased the lighting, productivity went up. When they decreased it, productivity also went up. When they changed break schedules in either direction, productivity went up. The conclusion that entered the literature, and that has been taught in management schools ever since, was that the workers were responding not to the specific changes, but to the act of being studied. The attention itself was the intervention. Being observed, being treated as worthy of scientific interest, being seen, that changed how people worked, regardless of what was being changed in their environment. This became known as the Hawthorne effect. The original studies were methodologically flawed in ways that later researchers have thoroughly documented, and the effect, as originally described, has proven considerably more complicated than its textbook version. But the core observation that being measured changes the behavior being measured is robust and replicates extensively across social science, medicine, and organizational psychology. When you tell people you're measuring their exercise habits change. When doctors know their prescribing practices are being audited, their prescribing practices change. When students know their work is being graded on a rubric, the work they produce reflects the rubric in ways that may or may not reflect genuine learning. The measurement and the thing being measured are not independent. They are in a relationship, and the relationship changes both of them. Now bring this inside. The practice of self-monitoring, tracking your mood, your productivity, your sleep, your food intake, your social media usage, your exercise, your spending, has become one of the defining features of contemporary attempts at self-improvement. The quantified self, the habit tracker, the mood journal, the dashboard of personal metrics that promises to make the invisible visible, to give you data about your own life, to let you optimize what you can now measure. The promise is appealing, and the impulse is legitimate. You cannot improve what you cannot see. Bringing behavior into conscious awareness is often the first step toward changing it. There is real value in the practice, but the observation effect means the practice is doing more than it claims. It is not simply revealing what was there. It is participating in constituting what is there. The act of tracking your mood changes your relationship to your mood. The act of monitoring your productivity changes your experience of productive work. The act of measuring your social media usage changes how social media usage feels, and not always in the directions the monitoring intends. Consider mood tracking as a specific case. The intention is to identify patterns, to notice that you feel worse on certain days, better in certain conditions, to understand what influences your emotional state so you can make better choices. A reasonable goal. But the daily act of rating your mood on a numerical scale does something else simultaneously. It directs your attention toward your mood as an object of evaluation. It creates a habit of checking, how am I feeling, that may increase the salience of negative states, since those are the anomalies that monitoring is designed to catch. It can transform what was a background condition into a foreground concern. The measurement creates an observer, and the observer changes the observed. This is not an argument against self-knowledge. It is an argument for being honest about what self-monitoring actually produces, which is not a transparent window onto a pre-existing internal reality, but a particular kind of relationship with your inner life, one that has its own costs and distortions alongside its genuine benefits. The same dynamic, operating at a completely different scale, is what makes the contemporary information environment so specifically damaging to the kind of thinking this series has been trying to cultivate. You are monitoring the news. You are tracking the crises. You are staying informed. And the systems delivering that information are monitoring you back with tools of extraordinary precision and using what they learn to change what they show you next. This is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. The attention economy runs on engagement, and engagement is maximized not by informing people, but by activating them, specifically by activating the emotional states most reliably associated with continued attention. Outrage, anxiety, tribal solidarity, the pleasurable sense of having one's existing beliefs confirmed, the threat response that evolved to keep you scanning the horizon for predators has been repurposed with remarkable efficiency to keep you scanning a feed. The observation is bidirectional in a way that has no real precedent. When you watched the evening news in 1985, the broadcast was not watching you back. It could not register your emotional response, identify which stories held your attention longest, and use that information to select tomorrow's broadcast. It could not build a model of your psychological vulnerabilities and serve your content calibrated to exploit them. The information environment was imperfect and had its own distortions, but it was not a system that learned from and adapted to your specific patterns of engagement in real time. The current environment is exactly that system, and the result is a feedback loop that the observation effect illuminates with uncomfortable precision. Your emotional responses to content generate data. The data is used to select further content. The further content is selected to maximize engagement, which means it is selected to activate the emotional states that produced the highest engagement previously. Your attention shapes the information environment. The information environment shapes your attention. The observer and the observed are modifying each other continuously, and the direction of modification is determined not by your well-being or your epistemic accuracy, but by the optimization target of a system yours interests and yours are not aligned. This is the Heisenberg problem at civilizational scale. You cannot observe the current information environment without being changed by the act of observing it. The question is not whether the observation disturbs the system. The question is whether you are aware that it does, and whether that awareness changes anything about how you engage. Heraclitus, from part 1, said you cannot step into the same river twice. The observation effect adds a darker corollary. Every time you step in, you change the river, and the contemporary information river is one that changes specifically in the direction of trapping you, of becoming more of whatever kept you standing in it the longest. The dialectical pattern is visible here, as it always is, whether systems' contradictions have been given enough time to mature. The thesis, information is power. Access to more information about the world allows you to understand it better, act more effectively, participate more meaningfully in public life. The explosion of available information that the internet represented was, on this thesis, an unqualified good, a democratization of knowledge that would produce a more informed, more capable, more engaged citizenry. The antithesis, the information explosion, operating through the attention economy, has produced an environment that degrades exactly the epistemic capacities it was supposed to enhance. The sheer volume creates the conditions for the engagement, maximizing systems to flourish. The apparent access to everything creates a susceptibility to the sophisticated management of attention that selects what you actually see. The feeling of being informed becomes a substitute for the slower, more effortful, more genuinely informative process of actually understanding something. More information produced less understanding. Wider access produced narrower attention. The quantitative leap generated a qualitative change in the wrong direction, or, at minimum, in a direction that requires active resistance rather than passive consumption. The synthesis is not yet fully visible, which is typical of historical moments inside the antithesis. But its outline can be traced. It involves not a return to information scarcity. That thesis is gone and cannot be restored, and not the paralysis of radical disengagement. It involves a different relationship to the information environment, one that requires understanding how the observation effect operates in order to resist its most destructive consequences. What does that different relationship actually look like? The first principle is the distinction between information consumption and information digestion. Consumption is passive, high volume, and driven by the feed. Digestion is active, selective, and driven by a question you brought to the information rather than one the information generated in you. The difference is not about the content. It is about the direction of the relationship. Did you arrive with a question and use the information to address it? Or did the information generate a reaction in you that you're now trying to manage? The observation effect tells you that the second mode is not neutral. When your attention is captured and directed by an engagement optimizing system, you're not simply receiving information. You're being changed by the act of receiving it in ways and directions that the system is specifically designed to produce. The change is not always bad. Sometimes outrage is the appropriate response to genuinely outrageous events. But the system cannot distinguish between appropriate and manufactured outrage. It can only distinguish between high engagement and low engagement. And high engagement, reliably, is what it serves you more of. The second principle is temporal. The observation effect is strongest in real time. The emotional activation that makes a story feel urgent, the tribal identification that makes it feel personal, the certainty that makes it feel clear. These are all most intense in the immediate moment of encounter. They are also least reliable as guides to what is actually important and what your actual response should be. Almost everything looks different 24 hours later. Almost everything looks different a week later. The stories that felt like civilizational turning points fade into the background noise of the continuous crisis cycle. The stories that seemed to require immediate response often turn out to require nothing of the kind. The information that seemed crucial to have in real time often turns out to be superseded, corrected, or contextually transformed by information that arrives later. This is not an argument for ignorance. It is an argument for latency, for building deliberate delays between encountering information and acting on it, between feeling a response and expressing it, between the arrival of a story and the formation of a settled view about what it means. The observation effect is time-sensitive. Giving it time to decay before you act on it is one of the most consistently effective epistemic practices available. The third principle concerns the difference between the map and the territory, a distinction that the Russian-American philosopher Alfred Korzybski identified in 1931, and that has never been more practically relevant than it is now. The information environment is a map. It is a representation of events, filtered through countless editorial choices, platform algorithms, economic incentives, ideological commitments, and the inherent limitations of language and image. The territory, the actual events, the actual lives of actual people, the actual functioning or dysfunction of actual institutions, is not the same as the map. Every map distorts the territory it represents. The question is not whether the map is perfect, but whether you remember continuously that it is a map. The specific danger of the current information environment is that it is extraordinarily good at producing the feeling of direct contact with reality. The visceral immediacy of video, the first-person testimony of social media, the apparently spontaneous reaction of public opinion, while actually interposing an increasingly sophisticated system of mediation between you and the events it represents. Maintaining the distinction requires effort, because the design of the environment works against it. Every feature of the interface is optimized to make the map feel like the territory, because the feeling of direct contact with reality is more engaging than the awareness of mediation. Knowing this is the first defense against it. Here is where the personal and the political converge in a way that is difficult to separate. The 2 a.m. feeling that opened this series, the sense that the systems trusted to hold things together are visibly straining, is real. The problems that generate it are real. The observation effect does not mean that what you're observing isn't happening. It means that your observation of it is being shaped by systems with interests distinct from yours, and that the shaping is making it harder, not easier, to understand what is actually happening and what, if anything, you can usefully do about it. The specific damage is this. The engagement, optimizing environment is very good at producing feelings of concern, outrage, and urgency, and very bad at producing the kind of sustained, nuanced, contextually rich understanding that would actually help you navigate the things you're concerned about. It gives you the emotional experience of engagement with serious problems without the cognitive tools to do anything about them. It produces a kind of performative relationship with the world's difficulties. You feel them intensely. You share them widely. You are changed by them emotionally, while leaving the actual problems untouched and your actual capacity to address them undeveloped. This is the most specific cost of the observation effect in the contemporary context. Not that the problems aren't real, not that concern is inappropriate, but that the form in which the problems are delivered to your attention is optimized for your continued engagement with the delivery system, and that optimization works against the development of the kind of thinking that would actually be useful. The alternative is not detachment. Detachment from genuine problems is its own kind of failure, a privilege that the problems themselves often cannot afford. The alternative is what the philosopher Simone Weil called attention, a quality of presence that is fully engaged with its object while remaining, paradoxically, uncaptured by it. Attention in Weil's sense is not passive. It is one of the most demanding activities available to a human mind. It requires resisting the pull toward the reactive, the immediate, the emotionally activating, and holding instead a kind of patient, deliberate focus that allows complexity to reveal itself rather than forcing it into the simplified shapes that engagement optimized systems prefer. That kind of attention cannot be sustained at the pace the information environment demands. It requires slowness. It requires selectivity. It requires the willingness to know less about more things in exchange for knowing something real about a few. It requires, in the end, the recognition that the most important observation you can make about the information environment is the one the information environment is least interested in helping you make. You are not just watching it, it is watching you back, and it is very good at what it does. There's a version of this moment that goes badly. You've spent real time and real effort developing a more sophisticated relationship with uncertainty. You've learned to ask what would falsify a claim before accepting it. You've started noticing when your own paradigm is defending itself against evidence that should move it. You've caught yourself constructing narratives and recognized the construction. You've begun holding your beliefs as probabilities rather than positions. You've built on provisional foundations without pretending they are permanent, and you've developed a more honest relationship with information and what it does to your attention. And then you walk into a conversation, or open a newsfeed, or sit in a meeting, or try to explain something you actually understand to someone who prefers the simpler version, and you discover that none of this makes you easier to be around. It makes you harder. The calibrated uncertainty reads as evasion. The paradigm flexibility reads as inconsistency. The epistemic humility reads as incompetence. The person who never backs down, never caveats, never says, "I'm not sure that's really my area," that person gets listened to. You, with your probability distributions and your falsifiability questions and your carefully updated priors, get talked over. This is the part of the story that usually gets left out. The tools in this series are not socially rewarded in the environment this series has been describing. They are socially penalized. Confidence gets mistaken for competence. Certainty gets mistaken for knowledge. Admitting ignorance gets mistaken for having nothing to contribute. The incentive structure of the current epistemic culture, the attention economy, the discourse of total conviction, the book deals and platforms that go to people who have an answer for everything, actively selects against the practices these 8 parts have been trying to cultivate. Naming this honestly is not a reason to abandon the tools. It is a reason to understand clearly what you're actually building and why. Aristotle had a different approach to ethics than most philosophers who came after him. The dominant tradition in Western moral philosophy, the one most people encounter in school, if they encounter any, asks what the right thing to do is. It constructs principles and applies them to situations. It asks whether an action maximizes welfare or respects duty or conforms to a rule you could consistently universalize. These are useful questions. They produce genuine insight about specific dilemmas. But Aristotle thought they were, in a certain sense, asking the question in the wrong order. His primary concern was not what to do, but what to become. If you develop genuinely good judgment, if you become a person of practical wisdom, then you will be far better positioned to figure out what the right thing to do is in any specific situation than you would be if you simply had a rulebook to follow. The world is too complex, and situations are too various to be fully handled by rules. What you need is not a better algorithm. What you need is a better character. This insight applies with equal force to the problem of knowing. The tools in this series are not a rulebook. They are not an algorithm you run on incoming information to produce correct outputs. They are practices for developing a particular kind of epistemic character, a way of being in relation to evidence and uncertainty and change that is more honest, more flexible, and more genuinely useful than the alternatives. That character has identifiable features, not as a fixed destination you either reach or don't, but as a direction of development, a set of qualities that can be more or less present, more or less cultivated, in anyone who takes the project seriously. The first quality is about motivation, and it is the hardest one to be honest about. There are 2 fundamentally different reasons to engage with evidence and arguments. One is to find out what is true. The other is to confirm what you already believe, defend what you've already invested in, or reach a conclusion that serves interests you may not fully acknowledge to yourself. These 2 motivations rarely appear in pure form. Most of the time, they're mixed, and their mix shifts depending on the stakes and the topic and the identity commitments involved. The epistemically virtuous person, the person this series has been trying to help you become, is not someone who has eliminated the second motivation. That is not available. The motivated reasoning, documented in Part 5, the paradigm defense, described in Part 3, the narrative construction explored in Part 4. These are structural features of human cognition, not moral failings you can simply choose to stop committing. They are the software you're running, and it is not going to be replaced. What changes with practice is your ability to catch the second motivation operating and to name it, at least to yourself, at least sometimes, at least on the questions that matter most. The question, am I engaging with this because I want to understand it, or because I want to be right about it? Sounds simple. Asking it seriously, repeatedly, about the beliefs you are most attached to, is one of the most demanding intellectual practices available. And here is the self-implicating version that has to be included honestly. The person who has spent time with these ideas is not immune to the motivated reasoning they describe. Knowing about confirmation bias does not eliminate confirmation bias. Knowing about paradigm defense does not mean your paradigm stops defending itself. The tools sharpen your vision of the territory. They do not change the fact that you are always, inescapably, looking at the territory from somewhere. What they do is make from somewhere more visible. And that visibility is not nothing. It is, in fact, the beginning of everything else. The second quality is consistency, and specifically the hardest kind of consistency, which is applying the same level of scrutiny to claims you want to be true as to claims you want to be false. This is where the tools become most personally costly, because the beliefs most in need of rigorous examination are almost always the ones most tightly woven into your identity, your political framework, your professional self-conception, your narrative about your most significant relationships, your theory of why your life looks the way it does. The falsifiability question from Part 2 is easy to apply to claims made by people you distrust. It is genuinely difficult to apply to the frameworks that organize your experience of the world. The Bayesian updating from Part 5 is relatively comfortable when updating peripheral beliefs. It requires something close to courage when the belief that needs updating is load-bearing. Consistency means applying the same standard regardless of the direction of the conclusion. It means being at least as interested in evidence that complicates your view as in evidence that confirms it. It means noticing when you're holding a source so a higher standard because you don't like its conclusions, and asking whether that differential scrutiny is warranted by something other than your prior commitments. This does not mean treating all claims as equally credible. It does not mean false balance, pretending that fringe positions deserve the same weight as well-evidenced ones simply in the name of symmetry. Consistency is not the same as indiscriminateness. It is the commitment to applying your actual standards even-handedly, rather than selectively deploying rigor against conclusions you already oppose and suspending it for conclusions you already favor. Most people, if they are honest, fail this standard regularly. The goal is to fail it less often on the questions that matter most than you did before. The third quality is what an older tradition would simply call intellectual courage, and what the contemporary discourse around expertise has made newly complicated. There is a specific form of courage that the current environment demands and simultaneously punishes. It is the courage to say what you actually think, when what you actually think is uncertain, qualified, or at odds with what your community of reference expects. It is the courage to say, "I was wrong about this, and here is why I've changed my position." In a discourse that treats position changes as weakness, it is the courage to say, "This is genuinely outside my expertise, and you should weight my opinion accordingly." In a culture that rewards confident pronouncements regardless of its foundation, these acts of epistemic honesty have measurable costs. The person who expresses calibrated uncertainty is perceived as less authoritative than the person who expresses false certainty, even when the calibration is epistemically superior. The person who admits a mistake opens themselves to attacks that the person who never admits mistakes can always deflect. The person who acknowledges the limits of their expertise reduces their perceived status in domains where performed expertise is rewarded, regardless of its accuracy. Knowing this does not make the courage unnecessary. It makes it more clearly what it actually is, an act with costs, not a costless virtue. And understanding it as such changes the nature of the practice. You're not simply developing good epistemic habits in a neutral environment. You're developing them in an environment specifically structured to make those habits costly and their opposites rewarding. That is a different project, requiring a different kind of commitment. The fourth quality is humility, but a specific kind that is easy to mistake for its lesser substitutes. Epistemic humility is not the performance of uncertainty, the rhetorical hedge that makes you sound thoughtful while actually protecting your position from engagement. It is not the false modesty that says I could be wrong while behaving in every practical way as if you couldn't be. It is not the strategic caveat designed to preempt criticism rather than to accurately represent your actual confidence level. Genuine epistemic humility is the accurate recognition of what you know and what you don't, communicated honestly to yourself and to others, in a way that actually changes how you hold and express your positions. It is what Part 6 called building on provisional foundations, not pretending the foundations are permanent, not being paralyzed by their provisionality, but being honest about both the building and the ground. In practice, this means something harder than it sounds, maintaining a clear and updated accounting of where your actual competence ends. Not the general disclaimer that nobody knows everything, but the specific, demand-relative acknowledgements that here, on this question, your knowledge is thinner than your confidence might suggest. That here, the findings you're relying on are more contested than the certainty you're expressing implies. That here, a genuine expert would see things you can't see from where you're standing. The person who has internalized this quality is identifiable not by what they claim to know, but by how they relate to the edges of their knowledge. They treat the edges as interesting rather than threatening. They are more curious about what lies beyond their competence than defensive about its limits. They point toward the limits explicitly, rather than papering over them with the confidence that the current culture rewards. These qualities, honest motivation, genuine consistency, real courage, actual humility, are not separate virtues that you develop independently and then combine. They are aspects of a single orientation toward knowledge and uncertainty that develops or fails to develop as a whole. You cannot have genuine consistency without honest motivation, because the motivation determines which evidence you're willing to be consistent about. You cannot have genuine humility without real courage, because acknowledging the limits of your knowledge requires exactly the willingness to accept costs that courage describes. And they develop not through the acquisition of more information, but through practice, repeated, imperfect, sometimes failing practice of the habits this series has been describing. This is the Aristotelian point in its full force. The tools in parts 1 through 7 are not knowledge you acquire and then possess. They are practices that shape character through repetition. You become someone who asks what would falsify a claim by asking it again and again until the question becomes a reflex. You become someone who notices paradigm defense by catching yourself doing it repeatedly until the catching becomes faster than the defending. You become somewhat capable of genuine Bayesian updating by actually updating at cost in situations where the update is uncomfortable, until the discomfort becomes familiar and therefore more manageable. The character is the accumulated residue of the practice, and the practice is never finished. Here is what that unfinished practice looks like from the inside. On an ordinary day, in the middle of the problems that opened part 1, the news arrives and activates the response the platform was designed to produce. You feel the pull of the narrative, the clean story, the identifiable villain, the satisfying certainty that your prior assessment was right, and you notice the pull. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than you used to. You catch the moment between the stimulus and the response, and you ask, is this what the evidence actually shows? Or is this what the evidence looks like when it's been selected and framed by a system whose interests and mine are not the same? The conversation arrives where the person across from you is performing expertise they don't quite possess. The confident pronouncement on a complex situation, the certain answer to a question that has no certain answer. And instead of either deferring to the performance or dismissing it entirely, you find yourself applying, quietly, the discrepancy question. How much of this confidence is warranted by what they actually know, and how much is the cultural reward for performed certainty doing the work? The crisis arrives, personal, professional, political, that the old frameworks can't adequately handle. And somewhere in the disorientation, alongside the genuine difficulty, you find yourself asking the questions from part 1. What has been building here? What opposing forces are losing their balance? What is this ending making room for? Not as consolation, not as a way of minimizing the loss, but as a genuine reorientation from the experience of chaos to the experience of standing at a recognizable, if deeply uncomfortable, threshold. None of this makes the crisis smaller. None of it produces certainty where there is none to be had. None of it eliminates the 2 a.m. feeling that started this whole series. What it does is change your relationship to that feeling, from evidence of breakdown to signal of process, from proof that things are simply falling apart to data about a system in motion, a system that can, with the right questions, be partially understood, even when it cannot be controlled. There is a version of these tools that gets used badly. It is the version where the sophistication becomes a new form of arrogance, where the person who has learned to ask falsifiability questions uses them as a weapon to dismiss claims they don't like, rather than as a genuine practice applied consistently, where the person who understands paradigm shifts uses the concept to explain away legitimate criticism of their own positions as merely the old paradigm defending itself, where the Bayesian vocabulary becomes a way of performing epistemic virtue, rather than practicing it. This failure mode is important to name because it is available to anyone who engages seriously with these ideas, and it is specifically available to people who engage with them in the way this series has presented them, as tools for thinking better, which can become tools for thinking better about other people's errors, while remaining conveniently blind to your own. The check against this failure is simple to state and hard to practice. The tools apply to you first. The falsifiability question is most valuable when turned on your own most confident beliefs. The paradigm analysis is most revealing when applied to your own framework for understanding your situation. The underdetermination insight is most uncomfortable when you use it to examine the narrative you're telling about your own life. The Bayesian updating is most demanding when the belief that needs updating is one you've built your identity around. The person who has genuinely internalized these tools is not someone who has developed a superior critical apparatus for evaluating the world. They are someone who has developed a more honest relationship with their own position within it, with their own paradigms, their own motivated reasoning, their own constructed narratives, their own miscalibrated confidence. That is a more modest achievement than the series might have implied in its more ambitious moments. It is also, in practice, a harder and rarer one. Aristotle thought that if you asked people what they ultimately wanted, they would give you different answers: money, pleasure, status, love, but that behind all of them was a single thing: eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but meaning something closer to flourishing. To be fully alive in the way appropriate to a human being. He thought this required virtue, and he thought virtue required practice, and he thought practice required a community. People around you who share the commitment and who will call you back toward it when you drift. The epistemic version of this is available to you in fragments in ordinary life. It is present in the conversation where someone tells you honestly that your reasoning has a flaw you haven't noticed, and you receive it as a gift rather than an attack. It is present in the relationship where you can say, "I think I was wrong about this," without the relationship requiring you to have been right. It is present in any community, however small, that rewards calibration over confidence, updating over consistency, honesty about limits over the performance of boundless expertise. These communities are not common. Building them is one of the more valuable things the tools in this series make possible, because the person who has developed genuine epistemic humility and genuine intellectual courage is, among other things, safe to think with. They will not punish you for updating. They will not mistake your uncertainty for incompetence. They will apply the same standard to their own positions that they apply to yours. That quality, being safe to think with, is rarer and more valuable than being right. And it is, ultimately, what these 8 parts have been building toward. Not a set of techniques, not a philosophy to adopt and display. A way of being with uncertainty, with evidence, with change, and with the people navigating all 3 alongside you. That is more honest, more useful, and more genuinely alive than the alternatives the current moment is offering. The world is still falling apart. The 2 a.m. feeling has not been argued away. But you are, if you've been doing the work, becoming someone who can be genuinely useful inside that falling apart. Not by having the answers, by having the right relationship to the questions. That is not nothing. It is in fact almost everything. If you made it this far in the video, well, let me just say I'm surprised and humbled, but I also want to thank you for enduring my long-winded articulations. I do hope you subscribe because there is more to come. Take care.